You wake to the slow, dull sound of a morning bell somewhere beyond the narrow brick lanes. Its tone is heavy and deliberate, each strike allowed to fade into the soft morning haze before the next comes. The room you are in is dim even though it is morning. The tall, thin window faces east, but the light is gray, filtered by soot in the air and the lingering damp of London. You lie for a while, listening to the pattern of the bell, counting without meaning to. The bell is not for the hour, it is for a death. In this part of the city, such bells are rung in sets to indicate age. 9 slow tolls might mean a child. 3 sets of 20 could mean a long-lived elder. Some say they can tell the nature of the death just by the rhythm, but you suspect this is more neighborhood gossip than science. Historians still argue whether certain parishes had strict codes for tolls, or whether it was left to the whim of the sexton. You push back the heavy blanket, feet meeting the cool floorboards. The boards are uneven, and you step around the spot where one groans loudly. In the hearth, a few blackened coals from last night's fire hold no warmth. You set your palms on the mantel and lean forward slightly, peering at the cold ashes. They smell faintly of last night's lamp oil and a little of the damp from the chimney. Outside, the bell continues its work. The air through the cracked window smells of smoke, wet wool, and somewhere, a horse passing slowly. A cartwheel rumbles over a loose cobble, and you hear the clop of hooves echo in the closed street. In another building nearby, a faint cough breaks the quiet, then the slam of a door. In Victorian London, it is said the bell is not only a notice, it is also an invitation. A death in the neighborhood is not entirely private. It brings with it visitors, small trades, and the many observances of mourning that are both duty and display. Some claim that certain bell ringers exaggerated the number of tolls for families who paid them well, so that the neighborhood would think the departed had lived longer than they had. You wash your face in the basin by the bed, the water cool, almost metallic in taste and smell from the night in the pitcher. On the small table, your folded garments wait in a neat stack. Black wool coat, dark trousers, and the crepe armband you have worn for the past fortnight. The bell still sounds, though now it is further off. Perhaps the ringer has closed the shutters of the belfry. You think you hear the soft tap of rain beginning against the glass. The day has announced itself, and it is a day marked by death, though not yours, not yet. You dress slowly, letting the room keep its hush while the morning bell fades above the roofs. You reach first for the shirt you set out last night, the linen cool and faintly starched, then the waistcoat with small matte buttons that do not gleam. Shine is avoided today. Anything that catches the light feels wrong, as if it argues against the gravity of loss. You run your thumb along the black crepe armband, textured like a dry riverbed, and fasten it high on your sleeve. The fabric rasps softly, a whisper across paper. The coat waits on the chair back, heavier than it looks. When you lift it, the wool answers with a stored scent of soap and coal smoke. You settle it across your shoulders and feel how morning sits slightly restrictive, slightly formal, asking you to hold yourself as if watched. Full mourning here means strict plainness, dull black tones, crepe for trim, and if you wear ornaments at all, jet cut to swallow light. Queen Victoria's long years in black set the tone for much of the century. The color has become less a choice than a public language. You tie your neckcloth and smooth it once, the knot a little tight. The mirror in the corner is clouded at the edges, but it is enough. A narrow black band circles your hat, and you check that it lies flat, without a jaunty tilt. There is a hierarchy in these things: hatband, glove, ribbon, veil, and everyone seems to know it without saying. You lay out the gloves. They are kid leather, dyed to a deep, unreflective shade. You flex your hands inside them to see whether the morning damp has stiffened the fingers. You think of the box on your shelf, tied with string, and decide these will do. From the drawer, you take the small brooch you will wear today, a circular piece with a braided lock of hair sealed under glass. The hair rests like a pale river looped upon itself, an intimate keepsake turned outward for the street to read. Hair jewelry is common enough that the stationer sells patterns for plaiting it. Some workshops will weave a design while you wait. You pin it at the waistcoat's throat and breathe as the clasp catches. The glass is cool for a moment against your skin. You turn to the trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside lies the longer veil kept for formal calls, a fall of black crepe that softens everything behind it. You lift it and let it spill across your fingers, feeling the way it holds the air. Veils are troublesome. They catch on buttons, they drink soot, they drink tears, and they mutter against your lips when you speak. A neighbor brushes hers with diluted vinegar to lay the dust. Another stiffens the edge with sugar water. No two houses agree, and every house believes it is right. There is the matter of sound. Mourning has its own acoustics. The dry hush of crepe, the muffled thud of heavy cloth, the quiet tap of a hat brim as it is lowered. You move and the room answers less than usual, as if draped. A mainstream rule sits in your head like a clock. Widows in full mourning may be so for a year and a day at least, then pass to second mourning with some relief of fabric and trim. Men, by custom, keep black for a shorter span, often months rather than years, and mark it with bands and sober neckwear. These periods are printed in etiquette books as if they were mathematics. Yet the city bends rules to the purse. Working families shorten every stage and return to color when the week demands it. You pause at the drawer and take a small packet wrapped in newsprint. Inside is a sliver of black wax used to darken a scuffed button or a chip on a buckle, a mourning stick. It leaves a faint residue on your fingertips, a trace that will announce itself later when you lift your teacup. A fringe belief says one should never polish jet by breath on days when the bell has rung. Instead, rub gently with an old handkerchief and a drop of almond oil. You fasten your watch chain plain, dull, without charm or seal, and consider, briefly, the bright pin you wore in spring. You return it to the tray under a folded cloth. Even the suggestion of sparkle feels like speaking out of turn. In some households, the curtains are tied with black ribbon and the door knocker swathed. In yours, the sign will be what you wear. Clothing becomes a portable doorway, telling passers-by how to look at you. One uncertainty lingers, often argued at shop counters. Did most Londoners truly keep to the stages of mourning as the manuals prescribe, or take only what fit their lives? Some historians point to ledgers and advertisements from mourning warehouses. Others note the cost of crepe and jet, the work of laundering, and the way photographs and street sketches show a crowd speckled with many shades, not a uniform black. Memory is neat. Living rarely is. You choose what you can manage, and the city reads it as best it can. You slip the coat's second button through, then the third. Your shoulders settle into the garment, and you test a nod with the hat on, feeling the band press a clear circle against your brow. The mirror gives you back a calm face framed in soot-tinged light. You smooth the sleeve where the crepe band lies and feel its faint rasp once more, a last reminder before the day begins. Outside, a carriage wheel grinds slow along the stones. You take a measured breath and reach for the door latch, clothed not only for weather, but for custom. On the way out, you fold a black-edged handkerchief into your pocket. Its narrow border is almost a line drawn around your own hand, noticed by postmen, clerks, and neighbors. The fabric has been boiled with logwood to deepen its color. The laundress showed you the chips of that heartwood once, how they turn the water nearly ink. When the bell sounds again near or far, you will already be dressed to answer it. You press the door so the latch will not snap, and step into the softened morning, carrying this careful darkness with you. The cloth, the band, the buttons, the veil, each a word in the city's quiet grammar, fall into place as you begin the day. You lift the brooch again, not to change it, only to feel the weight settle properly. The glass is cool, the bezel smooth, the pin faintly rough, where it has been sharpened and resharpened by a careful hand. Within the little round, the lock of hair lies braided into a tidy oval, light against a backing of cream. You turn it to the window's gray light and see the plait's tiny ladders, each rung a hair catching what little mourning there is. It is a private keepsake made public, the kind of thing you would keep in a drawer, now worn at the throat for passers-by to read. The craft has its own quiet language. Palette work, they call it when hair is arranged flat with gum upon ivory card, in wisps and curls that look like ink strokes. Table work when the hair is braided, woven upon a small jig with pegs and pins, much like making narrow ribbons. There are minuscule looms for its spidery things that fold into boxes where a worker's fingers move with the same caution as a bookbinder. You imagine the artisan peering through a lens, steady breath so that the hair does not lift and drift. A drop of gum, a nudge of a broom-fine brush, a pause to let the curl decide the direction it wishes to lie. You settle the clasp and feel the brooch touch your skin through the linen. There is the faintest fragrance of almond oil from when you polished it last week, and something like dust, warmed by a candle. Jet ornaments are common companions to such pieces, buttons, beads, buckles, cut to swallow light, yet the hair speaks louder for being pale. It is astonishing how something so slight can seem to carry weight, as if memory itself had been braided and pinned. In this city and this century, hair work is a household art as well as a trade. It is something you might do at the table by lamplight, with directions from a stationer's booklet. The mainstream fact is easy to name. Hair jewelry becomes especially visible in the long shadow of the sovereign's grief. Years of black and the public face of sorrow make tokens of remembrance not merely tender, but proper. Shop windows fill with brooches, rings, lockets, and frames for parlor walls, sepia urns and weeping willows limbed in human strands, protected by convex glass like a small winter sky. Etiquette prints its opinions, and the streets answer with purchases. You hold the brooch steady and think of its path before it came to you. Hair is washed first in soap and water. Some add a pinch of soda to lift any lingering oils. It is sorted by shade, teased free of knots, and dried upon paper so it will not curl before it is asked to. For table work, there are patterns: 3-strand, 5, 7, and more, each decided by the number of pegs and the patience at hand. A finished braid is stitched to a silk ground or coiled into shapes that mean something: hearts, ovals, a tiny wreath. A rim of seed pearls might be added. Though pearls are temperate things in mourning, one hesitates before any brightness. There is a fringe tidbit that always makes neighbors lift their brows. Many a shop does not, in truth, use the hair you bring. Some workshops keep drawers of purchased hair bundles tied with thread, labeled by color and length, so that orders may be filled quickly. A brooch promised, "with your own dear lock," might in fact be made from a cousin of its shade, close enough for comfort and for commerce. Other places are scrupulous, sealing a customer's hair in paper while she watches and working it while she waits. You are never entirely sure which is which. Trust is part of the purchase price. You breathe and let the thought pass. What matters now is the wearing, not the ledger. The brooch sits as it should, just at the place where the neckcloth closes. A narrow border of black surrounds the pale hair like a drawn line around a name. You touch it once more to feel that the pin is true, because there is nothing so undignified as hunting through the street for a fallen remembrance. The glass sometimes clouds with breath in winter. A dab with a handkerchief puts it right. The back plate bears a maker's mark so small you think of a fly's foot. Under the mark is a hinge for a second compartment. Some brooches hide a tiny cavity where scents or a crumbled flower might rest. Others hold a smear of the very hair mixed with gum to make a brown wash, then painted as an urn upon the backing hair turned into its own picture. You think of the patience in that, taking the substance of the person and letting it become the shadow that honors them. People say hair lasts when other things do not. It resists damp, holds color, persists when cloth and paper go soft. This durability comforts the city. A keepsake that does not decay quickly feels like a promise one can keep. In the parlor of a friend, you have seen a great wreath under glass, shaped from hair gathered over a decade family, godparents, a neighbor lost to a fever, each cluster, a petal, each petal a name spoken once as it was stitched. There is a hush that falls around such objects, like the hush that falls around a sleeping child. Yet the scholars do not agree on every part of what the streets take for granted. One uncertainty is often argued in journals and at lectures. Did most hair ornaments truly belong to the deceased, or were many worn for the living as tokens of friendship and betrothal? The ledger of an artisan shows orders placed for wedding gifts, not funerals. The photographs show bright-eyed women wearing plated loops long before any bell tolled for their homes. Memory slides towards sorrow when we think of such work, but the century wore hair for love as much as for loss. Historians still argue whether mourning came to dominate the craft, or simply sit beside it, more visible because black frames the face so starkly. You smooth the collar and feel how the brooch anchors the day. Out of doors, a wagon rattles and a vendor calls in a level tone, careful not to sound merry. On another morning, you might tuck a small posy at your lapel. Today, the brooch is the only adornment that feels honest. A single bright oval in a field of dark. It touches your throat like a reminder to speak gently. There is a practical note you keep close. Never let the brooch pin catch the crepe. The open weave will cling and tear, and the repair will show. Slip a scrap of silk beneath the cloth when you fasten it, and the fabric will lie smooth. A laundress taught you this, tapping the tip of the pin against her palm as if it were a pen making a period at the end of a sentence. You have used the trick ever since. You let your hands fall to your sides and stand for a moment in the soft gray of the room. The air carries the faintest sweetness from a drawer where orris root keeps the linens dry. The brooch is warm now, shaped to your skin, a small sun caught in winter glass. If anyone asks on the street, you will nod, and they will understand without another word. In a place where grief is a language, this is one of its clearest letters, and you wear it so the day will know how to answer you. Word count, 1070. Awaiting continue. You said, continue. ChatGPT said, Section 4. You turn from the small table to the window, the shutters still drawn tight. The wood feels faintly cool and smells of dust that has not been disturbed since yesterday morning. You slip the brass catch and fold each shutter inward, one after the other, letting the dim light seep rather than pour into the room. London light in morning is different, soot-filtered, flat, almost deliberate in the way it refuses to brighten too quickly. The street outside lies muffled under this pale wash, every brick softened as if viewed through a veil. Closing shutters is a kind of ceremony here, as much part of the morning display as black cloth and crepe. In many houses, the shutters will stay turned inwards for the entire day of a funeral, some for the full span between death and burial. It is a signal for passers-by, just as drawn blinds in the evening mean rest. Closed shutters in daylight mean loss. You have seen a whole row of houses this way, a block turned to shadow, the only motion a curtain shifting faintly in a second-floor window. The wood panels in front of you carry traces of their making, plane marks, knots darkened by age, and tiny nails bent flush. Your fingers leave faint streaks in the dust as you steady one shutter on its hinge. The hinges answer with a slow creak, deep and unhurried. You close the last slat so that the street becomes a ribbon of gray between edges of dark. Then step back to see how the room changes. With the shutters closed, the corners deepen, the hearth becomes a small cave, and the air feels thicker. A mainstream fact is that Victorian households often kept both shutters and curtains, using them together for mourning. Heavy curtains would be drawn inside, shutters folded behind them, leaving just enough of a gap to let the day mark its passing. Etiquette writers sometimes insisted on shutters rather than curtains alone. It was considered a more respectable and unmistakable sign. In wealthier homes, footmen were tasked with opening them after the formal mourning period ended, a deliberate act marking the household's return to ordinary life. You notice the small latch at the base of the frame, meant to secure the shutters against wind. It is worn from use, the brass dulled almost to brown. Your hand lingers on it before turning away. Outside, you can still hear the bell, though now it sounds as if it is coming from behind a wall. Sound shifts when the shutters are closed. Even the rattle of a passing cart becomes a padded thump. Among the smaller, stranger customs is the covering of mirrors during mourning. Some say it is to prevent the spirit of the departed from becoming trapped in the glass. Others claim it spares the living from catching sight of their own grief when they are meant to think of another. You have seen neighbors hang a black shawl over the parlor mirror at the same time they close the shutters, turning the whole room inward. Historians still argue whether the mirror covering was truly common in London or more a rural habit, imported through household servants and then adopted in patches. The air in the room shifts as you move toward the hearth, less because of the light and more because of the absence of it. With the shutters turned, you notice how every sound you make seems closer, your own breath, the brush of cloth, the quiet weight of your steps on the boards. It is a contained space now, suited to the pace of morning, where nothing from the street intrudes too sharply. You stand a moment to adjust. Your eyes begin to find detail again in the dim. The grain of the table's top, the uneven stitches on the curtain hem, the faint line of soot where the wall meets the ceiling. The brooch at your throat catches no glint here, only soft shadow. There is a slight draft near the windowsill where the paint has cracked. You place a folded scrap of cloth in the gap, an old habit learned from winters past. Even the smallest care seems to matter more in such a room, part of keeping the world at a controlled distance. In the quiet, you think of rows of shutters on other streets, their backs painted pale cream, so that, when opened, they catch and scatter light into a room. Turned inward, they hold that light away, keeping what is inside untouched for a time. Beyond the wood and the dust, life goes on. A milkman's voice hums in the distance, careful to keep his tone low. A cartwheel clinks against stone. Somewhere, a door closes, with a sound like a padded book shutting. These noises reach you muted, like recollections half remembered, and the room feels content to keep them that way. You let your hand rest on the table beside the window. The grain is smooth, where palms have rested over years, rougher near the edges where sleeves have brushed. The smell of dust is faintly sweet, mingled with the last trace of coal smoke from the hearth. It is a stillness that the open street could not give, and it settles into you without demand. You look once more at the shutters, the neat meeting of their panels, the even spacing of their slats. There is nothing elaborate here, only the plainness that lets the gesture speak clearly. Anyone seeing them from outside would know at once. This house keeps company with grief today. You step back toward the center of the room, the dimness folding itself around you. It will stay like this until the day is done. When you open the shutters again, it will not be for the light alone, but for the change in the house that comes after the right number of days. For now, the room remains as it should, turned inward, quiet and steady. You step out into the narrow street, the air cool and damp, the stones beneath your boots carrying the sheen of an early drizzle. Along the row, several doorways wear the same black crepe as your sleeve strips of dull cloth tied in neat knots around brass knockers. The fabric stirs faintly in the breeze, never lifting far, as if gravity itself is heavier in such displays. A street sweeper passes, his broom whispering across the cobbles, careful not to brush too close to the threshold of the house where the bell tolled earlier. Walking past draped doorways is a lesson in unspoken acknowledgement. You neither stop nor hurry. You incline your head slightly if you know the family, less so if you do not. The drape says enough. Someone has gone, and the house declares it openly. It is both public and private public in the way it marks the building, private in the way no details are given. A mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, mourning crepe on a door or knocker was as much a signal as black dress on a person. It told visitors not to expect social calls and tradesmen to behave with quiet reserve. Etiquette books even suggested the proper width of the strip depending on the closeness of the loss. The smell here is of damp cloth, coal smoke, and a faint tang of iron from the street rails. A costermonger further down has stopped calling his wares and now stands with his cart half covered, as though to avoid the appearance of cheer. Your steps echo lightly between the brick fronts, and each doorway with its black sign seems to absorb a little of that sound. One fringe tidbit lingers in your mind. In some neighborhoods, especially the poorer lanes, families would borrow crepe from a neighbor or a pawnbroker's box of seasonal goods. The cloth might have hung on another door the month before, and might again on yet another next week. It was not about possession. It was about presence, making sure the sign was shown, no matter how it was procured. The shops that specialized in mourning goods often had a separate ledger for such rentals. Historians still argue whether the practice of door draping came from older rural customs of covering the entire entrance with black fabric, or whether it evolved independently in the city for more practical reasons. The rural style was sometimes an elaborate frame of crepe over a wooden support, blocking the doorway completely until the funeral was over. In London, with narrow streets and constant foot traffic, smaller signals were often more manageable. As you pass another draped door, you notice how the fabric frays at the ends, each thread clinging to its neighbors. Rain darkens the weave, giving it the look of velvet, though it is only crimped silk or cotton. The knot is pulled tight against the brass, a mark of care in the arrangement. A little above it, a narrow black-edged card is tucked into the doorframe, held by a sliver of wax, perhaps a note to visitors about the time of the funeral. A boy in a flat cap runs past, slows, and glances back at the crepe. Even children know the meaning, though they do not always honor it. This one keeps his voice down until he turns the corner, then resumes a louder stride. You recall how, as a child, you once dared to touch such a strip when no one was looking, feeling its strange texture and wondering how it could speak so much without a single word. The houses without drapes look sharper by contrast, their brass bright, their curtains open. This makes the mourning signs stand out more. The street itself feels punctuated by them, as though each one marks a small silence in the city's endless conversation. On some days, you could walk a whole quarter without seeing one. On others, every block would bear several. Your boots scuff lightly at a raised cobble, and you step over a thin stream of water trickling toward a drain. The drain smells faintly of old rain, soot, and something green from the river. In the distance, a horse stamps once, the sound carrying down the row. The fabric on the nearest knocker shifts with the movement of air, and you find yourself slowing for a moment, letting it move and settle. You keep walking, passing under the faint shadow of laundry lines stretched between second-floor windows, though today most of them are bare. Colorful washing would jar against the mood of the street, even without strict enforcement. Neighbors often kept their home's appearance subdued until the mourning cloth came down. It was an agreement without words, a shared understanding that certain days belong to stillness. As the row begins to curve, you glance back. The line of doorways, with their black signs at uneven intervals, seems like a sentence in which every pause has been marked in ink. You imagine the sound if each one were a bell instead of cloth, how the air would be filled with tones instead of quiet swaying. You turn forward again, the smell of damp brick in your nose, the light steady and gray. The city has many ways of telling itself what has happened, and this one, the crepe knocker, is among its simplest. You pass the last of the draped doors on this street, and the black cloth seems to follow you for a moment in your mind, even after it is out of sight. You pause at a shop front with a wide glass pane, its surface blurred at the edges by the day's damp. Behind it, a neat display stretches from one side to the other rows of envelopes, each with a bold black border, and stacks of writing paper edged in the same dark frame. The mourning stationer's window is one of the most legible signs in the city. It tells anyone passing that words will be written for the sake of loss. The smell of paper reaches you even here, faint but distinct when the door opens for another customer. It mingles with the sharper scent of printer's ink and the starch used to stiffen cardstock. On the far right of the display, a small brass stand holds visiting cards already printed with the words, "In deepest sympathy," the rest of the space left blank for a hand to complete. Beneath them sit sheets of paper folded into thirds, tied with black ribbon as if they were already letters waiting to be sent. A mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, mourning stationery was considered an essential part of proper etiquette. If you had cause to write of a death or to acknowledge another's loss, you did so on paper bordered in black. The width of the border could even suggest how recent or severe the loss was. Thick for the first months, narrowing over time until plain white was resumed. Some households kept two sets of paper for years, one for ordinary correspondence, one for condolences and announcements. You lean closer to see the finer items: embossed seals with crests in black wax, pencils tipped with jet handles, pen holders painted in glossy enamel to match the black borders of the paper they would mark. The reflection of your coat in the glass makes it seem as if you are already inside the display, standing among the paper and ink. One fringe tidbit comes to mind. Certain stationers offered mourning ink made with added lampblack, intended to be darker than the standard blue-black used in ordinary letters. The bottles bore small paper collars advising that the ink was fast and unyielding in color, though many said it wore out a pen's nib more quickly. Some writers mixed their own, grinding a scrap of soot into the inkpot before beginning. Historians still argue whether mourning stationery was truly universal among working-class Londoners, or whether its presence in poorer households was more often borrowed or improvised. Letters have been found from laborers written on plain paper with black borders drawn by hand, a careful but inexpensive imitation of the shop-bought kind. Others seem to have done without entirely, relying on the letter's content to speak for itself. The stationer's window also holds a small box of black-edged envelopes addressed in a perfect copperplate hand. They are samples, meant to show the skill of the shop's writers for those who could afford to pay someone else to compose their correspondence. In the far corner, a hand-lettered sign reads, "Messengers available at all hours." The words underscored twice. In mourning, time is counted differently, and the arrival of a letter often determines the day's shape. Through the glass you can see the shopkeeper, a man in a high collar and dark waistcoat, arranging a stack of paper so that its borders align precisely. His fingers are deft and sure, accustomed to handling goods that are both practical and ceremonial. Behind him, shelves hold more boxes, their labels written in a spare, dignified script. Small border, medium border, double rule, black seal. You imagine stepping inside, the floorboards dark with polish, the faint grit of coal dust underfoot, the slight weight of the door as it closes behind you. The air would be warmer than outside, thick with the scent of ink, glue, and paper. The shop bell would give a single ring, then fall silent. On the pavement, another passer-by pauses to look in, then moves on. Perhaps they already have what they need at home, or perhaps they avoid buying it until absolutely required. There is a reluctance in some to keep mourning goods on hand. It feels too much like inviting their use. You step back from the glass, your own faint outline mingling with the reflected street. The window is a kind of mirror, though it shows you not your face, but the objects that will carry your words when speech would falter. It is a quiet commerce, one that keeps its voice low even in the busiest parts of the city. The black borders on the paper and envelopes seem darker against the gray day, each one a small frame, waiting to hold a message of absence. You watch the shopkeeper lift one, turn it under the light, and set it down again with care, as if it were already written and sealed. You know you will pass other such windows before the day is done, but each will carry the same quiet weight, a readiness to speak of loss in the proper form. You turn away, the muted sound of carriage wheels and soft footfalls taking the place of the stillness you leave behind. The stationer's goods remain behind the glass, lined and edged, waiting for the next hand to take them up. They will carry words to doors you may never see, but their meaning will be understood the moment the black edge is visible in the hand that delivers them. You pause at a shop front with a wide glass pane, its surface blurred at the edges by the day's damp. Behind it, a neat display stretches from one side to the other rows of envelopes, each with a bold black border, and stacks of writing paper edged in the same dark frame. The mourning stationer's window is one of the most legible signs in the city. It tells anyone passing that words will be written for the sake of loss. The smell of paper reaches you even here, faint but distinct when the door opens for another customer. It mingles with the sharper scent of printer's ink and the starch used to stiffen cardstock. On the far right of the display, a small brass stand holds visiting cards already printed with the words, "In deepest sympathy," the rest of the space left blank for a hand to complete. Beneath them sit sheets of paper folded into thirds, tied with black ribbon as if they were already letters waiting to be sent. A mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, mourning stationery was considered an essential part of proper etiquette. If you had cause to write of a death or to acknowledge another's loss, you did so on paper bordered in black. The width of the border could even suggest how recent or severe the loss was. Thick for the first months, narrowing over time until plain white was resumed. Some households kept two sets of paper for years, one for ordinary correspondence, one for condolences and announcements. You lean closer to see the finer items, embossed seals with crests in black wax, pencils tipped with jet handles, pen holders painted in glossy enamel to match the black borders of the paper they would mark. The reflection of your coat in the glass makes it seem as if you are already inside the display, standing among the paper and ink. One fringe tidbit comes to mind. Certain stationers offered mourning ink, made with added lampblack, intended to be darker than the standard blue-black used in ordinary letters. The bottles bore small paper collars advising that the ink was fast and unyielding in color, though many said it wore out a pen's nib more quickly. Some writers mix their own, grinding a scrap of soot into the ink pot before beginning. Historians still argue whether mourning stationery was truly universal among working-class Londoners, or whether its presence in poorer households was more often borrowed or improvised. Letters have been found from laborers written on plain paper, with black borders drawn by hand, a careful but inexpensive imitation of the shop-bought kind. Others seem to have done without entirely relying on the letter's content to speak for itself. The stationer's window also holds a small box of black-edged envelopes, addressed in a perfect copperplate hand. They are samples, meant to show the skill of the shop's writers for those who could afford to pay someone else to compose their correspondence. In the far corner, a hand-lettered sign reads, "Messengers available at all hours," the words underscored twice. In mourning, time is counted differently, and the arrival of a letter often determines the day's shape. Through the glass, you can see the shopkeeper, a man in a high collar and dark waistcoat, arranging a stack of paper so that its borders align precisely. His fingers are deft and sure, accustomed to handling goods that are both practical and ceremonial. Behind him, shelves hold more boxes, their labels written in a spare, dignified script: small border, medium border, double rule, black seal. You imagine stepping inside, the floorboards dark with polish, the faint grit of coal dust underfoot, the slight weight of the door as it closes behind you. The air would be warmer than outside, thick with the scent of ink, glue, and paper. The shop bell would give a single ring, then fall silent. On the pavement, another passerby pauses to look in, then moves on. Perhaps they already have what they need at home, or perhaps they avoid buying it until absolutely required. There is a reluctance in some to keep mourning goods on hand. It feels too much like inviting their use. You step back from the glass, your own faint outline mingling with the reflected street. The window is a kind of mirror, though it shows you not your face, but the objects that will carry your words when speech would falter. It is a quiet commerce, one that keeps its voice low even in the busiest parts of the city. The black borders on the paper and envelopes seem darker against the gray day, each one a small frame waiting to hold a message of absence. You watch the shopkeeper lift one, turn it under the light, and set it down again with care, as if it were already written and sealed. You know you will pass other such windows before the day is done, but each will carry the same quiet weight, a readiness to speak of loss in the proper form. You turn away, the muted sound of carriage wheels and soft footfalls taking the place of the stillness you leave behind. The stationer's goods remain behind the glass, lined and edged, waiting for the next hand to take them up. They will carry words to doors you may never see, but their meaning will be understood the moment the black edge is visible in the hand that delivers them. You follow the row until the smell of warm sugar finds you, a thin ribbon of sweetness winding through the damp. The baker's shop has its window fogged from within, softening the view of small cakes, seed loaves, and neat stacks of pale biscuits. On ordinary mornings, the front board is lively with plum buns and currant rolls, but today, the center of the display is sober. Paper packets edged in black, each tied with a narrow ribbon, each bearing a neat label, "Funeral Biscuits." The words sit calmly on the paper, as if naming a kind of weather rather than a kind of food. You push the door and feel its bell answer once, a muted ring that seems to respect the day. Inside, the air is a mix of flour dust, cooling sugar, and the faint steam of boiled syrup. A boy with a flour mark across one cheek brushes crumbs from the counter. He nods and keeps his voice low. Behind him, the baker lifts a tray from the oven, and the biscuits turn their pale faces toward the room, stamped with tiny emblems that catch and release what little light the morning allows. Funeral biscuits are not a novelty here. They are a staple of mourning like crepe and jet. The mainstream fact is simple. In Victorian London, these sweet, dry cakes, often finger-length, sometimes round, were offered to visitors who came to pay respects, tucked into black-edged packets, and carried away as tokens of the day. Some houses set a plate of them in the parlor beside the decanter of wine or the pot of tea. Others had them wrapped with a printed slip naming the deceased and the date. They are built to be handled, to be pocketed, to crumble neatly without fuss. The baker sets the tray on the marble and chooses a biscuit to show you. The top is stamped with a skull and crossed bones no larger than your thumbnail. The lines crisp, the edges faintly sugared. Another batch shows cherubs with downturned torches, wings folded, faces solemn. The molds lie on the shelf like small medals, tin dies pushed gently into the dough before baking, no deeper than a coin's relief. When you touch the cooled surface with a fingertip, it gives a whisper of sugar against skin. You ask for a dozen packeted for a morning delivery, and a dozen more to take now. The boy sets out paper, thick, white, edged with black. He folds it with squared corners the way stationers fold letters, then ties the ribbon in a flat bow. There is a method to the tying tight enough to hold the brittle edges, loose enough that an old person's fingers can undo it without trouble. He writes, with a pencil kept in the flour bin to keep its point dry, the name that will go upon the label. The smell of orange peel comes from the back room, and you see a small pan of candied strips cooling by the window. Sometimes the baker chops a fragment into the dough for a brighter scent, though not all approve. A few customers insist the flavor must be plain sugar and egg, perhaps a breath of caraway at most. A fringe tidbit the boy repeats as he works. One undertaker in the next parish orders tiny slips of paper with verses and has the baker enclose them in the packets, like fortunes that say nothing of the future, merely a line of comfort in faint ink. The slips are kept in a little tin labeled lines right beside ribbons and seals. You turn the sample biscuit in your hand. Its surface is dry, almost powdery, and when you break it, the fracture is so clean it sounds like a small twig. The inside is white and slightly glossy from sugar beaten hard with egg, meant to keep for days without softening. You taste a crumb and find sweetness without richness, a steadiness on the tongue that asks for tea or wine to complete it. A plate of these on a side table is food and symbol at once. Simple, portable, undemanding. The baker slides another tray into the oven and wipes his hands on a cloth the color of the morning. He tells you, not unkindly, that he keeps a separate bin of ribbon just for these orders, because the dye from some blacks can smear when tied in haste. He shows you the corner of one packet where a thumbprint has left a gray kiss. This one will be rewrapped. He is careful with these, not because they are fragile, but because they are read as much as eaten. You ask, as you often do, about the stamps. He turns the tin box so you can see. Skull and bones, cherub, willow tree, hourglass with wings, urn, and, oddly, an anchor. The anchor is for those who work the river, he says, or for anyone who liked the solid look of it, hope, some call it, though he does not insist upon the meaning. He has an old stamp of a beehive too, though he rarely uses it. People think of industry, not departure, when they see it. There is an uncertainty that scholars still circle around. How uniform were these biscuits in taste and form across the city and across the decades? Some sources claim they were almost indistinguishable from ladyfingers. Others describe them closer to a hard meringue or a simple shortbread. Recipes vary in saved notebooks, sugar to egg ratios, a whisper of lemon here, caraway there, even a spoon of treacle in poorer houses where white sugar is dear. Were the skulls and cherubs universal, or were they the flourish of certain streets and certain bakers? The record is uneven, as records often are for things everyone assumes they already know. The boy brings a small pair of scissors on a ribbon and clips the ends of the bows so that each packet looks like the next. He sets them gently in a shallow box with a black border drawn by hand ink on pasteboard, neat and unassuming. On the counter stands a jar with sprigs of rosemary, green in the dim light, and the baker tucks one into the string of the first packet by habit. The room smells briefly of resin and kitchen garden, a bright thread through sugar and steam. You think of how rosemary has stood beside Mourning for centuries, used to scent rooms, to carry in hands, to lay upon a lid. You ask whether the delivery can be made in an hour, and the baker nods. His boy will take the box under his arm, hat brim straight, boots brushed, voice kept down. The packet you carry now is light but definite in the hand, edges sharp against the palm. Through the paper you can feel the faint raised mark of the skulls, like print you can read without eyes. By the window, a customer stands uncertainly, then points to the cherubs rather than the bones. People choose for reasons they rarely say aloud. Some want symbols to speak plain, others prefer them softened. You think of the many parlor tables that will bear these today, each packet a small square of order amid the careful clutter of a house made ready for callers. As you reach the door, the bell gives its modest note once more. You step into the gray light with your box pressed to your side, and the warmth of the shop lingers a moment on your skin. A cart rattles past, and the ribbon on the top packet trembles, then lies still. You imagine the biscuits in their neat paper being lifted later by many hands, accompanying words that don't need to be clever, only kind. You turn down the lane, the scent of sugar slowly swallowed by London's coal and damp wool. In your pocket, the black-edged handkerchief rests beside your keys. In your arms, the biscuits mark you as part of the day's work of mourning. They will be set out simply. They will be eaten quietly, and their little stamps will be noticed and forgotten in the same breath. This is their task, and they do it well. To offer a sweetness that does not argue with sorrow, only stands beside it. You step into the narrow tea parlor at the corner, its sign painted in gilt letters that have dulled to a polite bronze. The door's hinge moves without protest, and the faintest chime from a low-toned bell marks your arrival. Inside, the air is warm with the mingled scents of steeping leaves, damp wool coats, and the faint sweetness of bread just taken from an oven somewhere behind the counter. Light from the street comes through tall windows, softened by the grayness outside and the moisture on the glass. Every table holds a small arrangement of white flowers, chrysanthemums today, their petals curled inward like careful hands. You remove your hat and nod to the woman behind the counter. She knows without asking to bring you the same as always. A pot of black tea, strong, with a slice of lemon to soften the edge. Your seat is near the wall, where you can see both the street and the long mirror above the counter. The mirror, like the window, offers a softened world, its surface faintly streaked from the cloth, its reflection touched with the amber of gaslight. In Victorian London, tea parlors like this were more than a place for refreshment. They were one of the few public rooms where those in mourning could sit without pressure to perform cheer. That is the mainstream fact. Etiquette allowed you to take tea in public while in mourning, provided your dress was correct and your manner subdued. Here, voices are kept low not because it is required, but because the room itself seems to ask it. Outside, a small procession passes a hearse with glass sides, curtains drawn inside, a coffin visible through the dim reflection of the street. Two mutes walk ahead, their long coats swinging with each step, hats banded in crepe. Conversations in the parlor fall still until the last black-plumed horse has turned the corner. The only sound then is the faint bubbling from the tea urn and the creak of a chair leg against the floor. The tea arrives on a tray, its cups thin enough that you can see the shadow of the spoon through the porcelain. Steam curls upward, bringing with it the faint tannic scent of strong leaves and the bright top note of the lemon slice. You pour slowly, the liquid falling in a dark ribbon before settling in the cup. The sugar bowl is there if you want it, though many in mourning forego sweetness in drink, preferring the plainness as part of the observance. A fringe tidbit is sometimes whispered among regulars. Certain tea shops in the city, especially those near undertakers, kept a separate room at the back for families awaiting the return of a funeral party. There, the curtains would be drawn more heavily, and a clock kept slightly fast, so that no one lingered longer than they wished. Whether all such rooms truly existed, or whether they are only the invention of nostalgic talk, you cannot say, but the idea fits the city's habit of folding public spaces into private rituals. Historians still argue whether mourning etiquette in such places was rigidly enforced by owners or maintained naturally by patrons who understood without instruction. Some memoirs recall being corrected for speaking too brightly. Others remember only a general air of reserve, with no explicit rules beyond what the crowd provided. You sip the tea and feel it settle warmly. The cup is light in the hand, its rim thin, its heat rising toward your face. Across the room, a man sits with a black band on his sleeve, stirring his tea without drinking, eyes on the wet street beyond. Near him, a woman in a mourning bonnet turns the pages of a small black-edged letter, folding and unfolding it, as if the motion alone brought comfort. The room itself is a kind of pause. The gaslight hums faintly in its glass. The wallpaper bears a faint floral pattern whose colors are muted with age and tobacco smoke. The tables are small, round, their surfaces worn to a soft sheen by years of saucers and elbows. The teaspoons make only the gentlest sound as they are set down, the soft ring quickly swallowed by the air. When your pot is half empty, you take a moment to look outside again. Rain has begun, light but steady, streaking the window with slow lines. A costermonger hurries past, his cart covered in canvas. Behind him, a boy in a wide cap steps carefully to avoid the gutter's water. The black crepe on a nearby doorway flutters once and then hangs still. You refill your cup and let it sit a moment, the heat drawing the fragrance upward. The lemon slice has released more of its oil, a bright note against the tea's weight. In the corner, the shop cat curls in a chair, tail wrapped to nose, entirely unconcerned with the business of the day. You finish your tea without hurry. The sound of chairs shifting tells you others are leaving, their coins placed quietly on the counter. You put on your hat again, the brim damp from where you set it near the window. Your coat takes back the cool of the room, and you step to the door. The hinge moves as silently as before. The low-toned bell sounds once more. You step into the wet air, the smell of tea leaves still on your hands, and the sight of the street gray, measured, draped in its own kind of quiet, waiting for your next turn along it. You come to the corner where the undertaker keeps his rooms, the glass already beaded with rain. Beneath the awning stand two men so still they seem part of the doorway, tall hats banded in crepe, long black coats without ornament, gloves that swallow their hands to the wrist. They carry short staffs wrapped with black ribbon, the ends cut square like the tongues of mourning banners. They do not look at one another, and they do not look at you. They look instead at the wet street, as if listening to it breathe. These are the mutes. They are hired, silence made visible. Their task is simple and not simple: to walk before the hearse, to stand at the door while the coffin is borne out, to hold stillness so steady that everyone else can borrow a little of it. They are paid for the absence of talk, for the absence of expression, for the way they allow sorrow to move past them without comment. The undertaker steps out to confer, his voice low, his gestures small, as if the air itself might bruise. One mute lifts his staff a fraction. The ribbon gives a soft sigh and lies back against the wood. On their hats, the crepe band is wide and deliberate, the knot tucked cleanly to the side. The coats are cut long so they answer every step with a slow swing. You notice the boots blacked to a dull finish, not glossy, because shine would be chatter. A mainstream fact is this: professional mutes were a known feature of Victorian funerals, especially among the striving and respectable middle classes. They appear in trade directories and in the undertaker's bills, in prints and in the too knowing pages of novels. They walked ahead of the carriage to set the tone, to declare by their bearing that grief had business in this street and that the city should conduct itself accordingly. The presence of mutes was not merely ornament, it was instruction. The rain thickens for a moment, and the men do not shift. Water beads on the brim of each hat and gathers into a line that drops, regular as a clock, onto the pavement. A boy with a ledger under his arm glances up at them and lowers his eyes again, as if silence were contagious. From the doorway, the undertaker's assistant brings a length of black cloth to touch up one staff's ribbon where a thread has lifted. He smooths it down with a finger dampened in the rain, and it stays. There is a faint smell of wet wool and horse about the awning. Beyond it, the street shows the day's careful behavior. Vendors speaking gently, neighbors pausing to the side, a coster's dog sitting without being told. The mute stillness changes the neighborhood's pace by a half step. Everything seems to move around them as water moves around a piling. You have seen them on other days in other streets, and you know the particulars vary. Sometimes there are two, sometimes four, and sometimes only one if the family is modest or the lane is narrow. Sometimes the staffs are tipped with small velvet spheres, sometimes with nothing more than a ribbon's end. At the grandest funerals there are plumes and panels and a small army of black coats. At humbler ones the mutes are the only theatrical note, and even then they are careful not to look like a show. A fringe tidbit. You have heard, and once you thought you saw, that a few mutes keep a notebook not of names, but of posted distances, pacing out a precise measure between door and carriage, between the corner and the church gate. They mark the number of steps under different weather, in different boots, with different lengths of coat, as if their craft were a kind of clockmaking done with feet. Another story says, a particular mute lined his coat hem with a narrow chain so the wind could not lift it and make him look untidy. If true, it is a piece of thoughtfulness no one would ever praise aloud. A cart rattles over a joint in the stones. The sound reaches you and then disappears against the soft wall of the mute's presence. You begin to understand why households hire them even when money is tight. They stand and absorb the day's stray noise, the odd whistle, the accidental smile. They turn a street into a passageway where one kind of walking is possible and every other kind is politely set aside. The undertaker nods to you in passing and vanishes within. From the second-floor window above, a curtain moves and stills. Somewhere inside, a door opens, and you hear the faint scuff of men shifting a weight. The mutes lift their staffs together, the ribbons hanging exactly alike, and step forward as if the street itself had invited them. A small uncertainty that scholars revisit. How common was the employment of mutes across the decades? And did their presence truly decline as quickly as some commentators suggest? Certain observers, with needles sharpened by satire, made them symbols of empty display in the 1832nd and 1842nd. Yet trade records and photographs show them lingering well into later years. Were they an everywhere custom briefly, or an occasional custom steadily? The answer shifts with each ledger examined, and each parish considered. In the city's memory, they are fixed. In the city's accounting, they are less so. They begin to walk, a measured pace that asks nothing of the bystander but room. You match your breath to it for a moment. 1, 2, 3. The soft fall of their boots, the only metronome. They pass the draped knocker you saw earlier. The ribbon stirs and then forgets them. A woman at an upper window rests her hand on the sill and does not wave. The men look neither left nor right. They have the narrow vision of a candle flame. You step aside to let them turn the corner. In the angle of their movement, you see what the trade gives them and what it asks. It gives them a coat that fits, a staff that steadies the hand, a place to stand where work is dignified by quiet. It asks them to be a bridge for other people's feelings, a device by which a complicated household can cross tidy into the street. They do this by not doing, and the not doing requires rehearsal of every limb. You follow at a distance for half a block, not because you must, but because the sight is easy to be near. There is a relief in a profession whose tools are time and restraint. They pause at a crossing to allow a dray to lumber past. The taller mute's ribbon brushes the side of his coat and leaves a darker line, almost invisible, that will vanish when the wool dries. They step on, and the street resumes its breathing. When they reach the house, they will stand at either side of the door, staffs upright, faces quiet. They will become furniture for a few minutes, a pair of dark posts framing the moment when the coffin comes down. Later, as the hearse moves, they will walk just ahead, shoulders set so that the plumes above the horses do not become the only moving thing to look at. At the churchyard, they will hold their place until the last necessity is done, salute once with the barest incline of the staff, and vanish like a period at the end of a sentence. For now, you let them go on without you, taking their weather with them. The air where they stood seems briefly emptier, as if silence has a shape that leaves when it moves. You turn your coat collar against the rain and continue down the street, the rhythm of their steps still ticking somewhere under your own. There will be other corners, other awnings, other pairs of men who trade in steadiness. You will know them, by the way. Everything around them becomes deliberate. You turn down a quieter lane, the sound of the mute steps still lingering, like an echo that refuses to fade. Here, the shop fronts are smaller, their windows set close to the street, and in the middle of the row sits a building whose sign is so plain you might miss it. Mourning Warehouse. The letters are painted in black without ornament, the glass scrubbed clear so that the goods within are seen without apology. A single strip of crepe hangs in the center of the window, not as a sample but as a curtain that frames what is on offer. Inside, the air is a mixture of new cloth, dusted wood, and the faint sweetness of lavender kept in drawers to discourage moths. Racks stand in tidy rows, holding garments in the full range of mourning, from the dull, heavy wool of first mourning to the lighter bombazine and silk of half mourning. Each coat, dress, and cloak is faced outward so that the texture of the fabric catches the dim light differently. Buttons are matte, never shining, stitched with black thread that blends into the cloth. The man behind the counter greets you with a nod that is both welcome and acknowledgement of your purpose. He knows not to ask why you've come. The door itself has already answered that. He gestures toward the shelves at the right, where gloves are arranged by size, each pair folded with its fingers resting neatly upon one another. The fingertips are slightly rounded, the stitching subtle, the leather softened for comfort in long wear. A mainstream fact sits easily here. In Victorian London, mourning warehouses offered one-stop outfitting for bereavement, renting as well as selling what was required. From garments to hats, veils, jet jewelry, and even hat bands for the family coachman, all could be acquired within the same walls. Etiquette demanded that one be dressed appropriately from the first public appearance after a death, and the warehouse made that possible without delay. On a side table lies a display of bonnets, some with crepe curtains that fall to the shoulder, others trimmed with lighter black silk for later stages. Veils hang beside them, each labeled with its length in inches, the weave of the netting visible even in the low light. A small mirror is set into the wall, its frame painted a dull gray so that no brightness distracts from the garments. A fringe tidbit the shopkeeper shares in a low voice. Some customers would quietly request linings or undertrimmings in colors. Only they would see deep plum, dark green, even midnight blue. These hints of color were never to be revealed in public, but served as a private comfort, a small rebellion against the strict monotone of mourning. The practice was frowned upon by the stricter guides of etiquette, yet persisted quietly, particularly among those who found the uniform black oppressive in long periods of grief. Historians still argue whether most Londoners truly adhered to the prescribed stages of mourning, full, second, and half, or whether these rules were more aspiration than reality. Trade records show brisk business in both full and half mourning attire, yet diaries hint at many who skipped straight to lighter fabrics or abandoned mourning early out of practicality or cost. The truth seems to vary as much as the households themselves. You move along the counter to where small boxes are stacked. Inside are mourning bands for hats, pre-tied cravats for men, black-edged handkerchiefs, and sets of jet buttons that could be sewn quickly onto an existing coat. The warehouse does not waste space. Each shelf carries goods for a specific moment in the progression of grief. From the back room comes the muffled thump of a bolt of cloth being laid upon a table. The sound is followed by the whisper of shears cutting through thick wool, a rhythm steady enough to be mistaken for breathing. You picture the seamstress, pins in her cuff, measuring with one hand while holding the fabric in place with the other, her stitches later disappearing into the black-on-black seams. Near the door, a small cabinet holds items for children, narrow bands of crepe, tiny gloves, and black sashes meant to be tied over a white frock. The sight is quiet but sharp. Even in its stillness, it insists that mourning is not reserved for the grown. Above the cabinet hangs a modest sign, goods for infants and youth, available by the week or month. You notice a ledger open on the counter, its entries written in a neat hand. Next to each customer's name is a list of items taken and a date for return. Some lines are crossed through. Others bear notes like crepe replaced, veil shortened, buttons mended. The shopkeeper does not hide the ledger. It sits as a reminder that mourning is as much about maintenance as it is about first purchase. At the window, a mannequin wears the full array: coat, veil, gloves, and hatband. The crepe falls to just above the mannequin's hands, the gloves buttoned with black glass, the coat's hem brushing the floor. A passerby slows to look in, eyes following the fall of the veil before moving on. You can see the faint outline of raindrops on the glass where his breath met the cold. You thank the shopkeeper and step back into the street, the smell of cloth lingering in your coat. Behind you, the warehouse returns to its quiet commerce, the shears already at work again in the back. You carry with you the sense that mourning here is as much about readiness as it is about display, an inventory to be kept in order for a moment that will always come. You follow the curve of the street until the rain settles into a fine mist, the kind that clings rather than falls. Ahead, A window glows faintly yellow in the gray glass panes turned slightly inward to catch the light. Above the door, the sign reads simply photographic portraits, the paint darkened by years of weather. In the window hangs a selection of carte de visite, each framed in cream mounts, the subjects posed in stiff dignity. Most are living faces, but in the lower corner you notice what you came for, a family group with one figure whose stillness is different. Inside, the studio is warm and smells faintly of varnish and dusted velvet. The floorboards creak in a polite way, as if to announce each footstep without complaint. Heavy curtains divide the waiting area from the workroom. Their folds are deep enough to swallow the sound of the street entirely. On the wall, a clock ticks softly, its brass pendulum catching and losing the light with every swing. The photographer emerges from behind the curtain, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. His waistcoat bears a faint dusting of chalk, likely from adjusting the backdrop. He greets you with a quiet nod, then turns to a small group seated near the far wall, a woman in full mourning veil, a man in a black cravat, and between them a chair with a figure arranged upon it. The child is dressed in white, the hands folded neatly in the lap. The pose is exact, the head held upright, with the aid of a stand hidden behind the chair. The mainstream fact is that post-mortem photography, though often spoken of in whispers now, was a common service in Victorian London. It offered a way to preserve the likeness of a loved one when no earlier photograph existed, or to fix the final image in memory with deliberate care. Studios like this one were prepared to handle such sittings without remark, providing backdrops, stands, and even subtle retouching to bring a lifelike softness to the features. On a side table rests a shallow box of cabinet cards, the backs printed with the studio's name in curling script. Some bear black borders, marking them plainly as mourning images. You turn one over and see a man's face, the eyes closed, the mouth softened, the collar arranged just so. The card is thick, its edges beveled, meant to be held without bending. A fringe tidbit the photographer once shared lingers in your mind. Certain studios kept a small stock of painted eyes, tiny, oval, and on thin card that could be added to a photograph in place of closed lids, making the subject appear awake. Whether this was done at the family's request or offered discreetly is less clear. The practice sits in that gray space between artifice and comfort. Some customers refused it outright, preferring truth over illusion, while others embraced it as a final kindness. Historians still argue whether most post-mortem portraits were taken in studios like this, or more often in the home. Evidence exists for both. Studio ledgers listing mourning sittings alongside ordinary appointments, and family albums containing images clearly staged in familiar parlors. The choice may have come down to means weather, or the photographer's willingness to travel with equipment through the wet streets. From behind the curtain comes the faint smell of lamp oil and the sharper scent of collodion. You can hear the careful movements of the assistant preparing the plate, each step deliberate to avoid rattling the glass. The photographer adjusts the child's small chair, smooths the skirt, and checks the tilt of the head. The parents watch without speaking. Their faces are not blank, but set in the kind of stillness that holds back everything but the task at hand. The backdrop is painted with a faint garden scene blurred leaves, a low balustrade, a hint of sky. Its edges are softened by the shallow depth of the camera's view. A gas bracket on the wall is turned low, its light aimed to catch the curve of the subject's cheek without glare. The air in the room seems to pause. When the moment comes, the photographer leans over the great wooden camera, cloth draped over his head and shoulders. He lifts one hand to signal the assistant, the other to steady the focus. The lens cap is removed, the plate exposed, and in those long seconds the room's silence is absolute. Then the cap is replaced, the plate lifted and carried swiftly away behind the curtain. The parents lean closer, adjusting a fold in the dress, a lock of hair at the brow. Another exposure will be taken insurance against the hazards of chemical development. The photographer speaks briefly, his words more to himself than to anyone else, about light and timing. The assistant's movements behind the curtain quicken. The smell of the chemicals grows sharper for a moment, then fades. You step toward the wall where finished portraits hang. Among them, some show children alone, some in the arms of parents, some with siblings holding hands. The mounting and framing are consistent creamboard, black border, the studio's name at the bottom in gold or silver ink. They look outward into the room without speaking, their expressions caught between the formal and the familiar. In the waiting area, a kettle simmers on a small iron stove, the steam curling into the air. The photographer offers the parents a cup each, the gesture unremarkable but steadying. Outside, the rain continues its fine mist, streaking the window in lines that blur the street beyond. When you leave, the bell on the door gives a sound just above a whisper. The light outside feels thinner after the gaslit warmth, and your coat takes on the smell of varnished wood and photographic chemicals. Behind you, the photographer will finish his work, the image fixed in silver and shadow, mounted and handed over with the same quiet care that marked the moment it was made. You walk on until the street narrows again, houses pressing close with doorsteps worn smooth by years of feet. Here, the knocker on nearly every door is wrapped in a strip of black crepe, but one doorway carries something more deliberate. A small stack of black-edged cards tied neatly with string, resting on a table just inside the threshold. The door is half open, and the smell of beeswax and cold stone drifts out, a faint echo of the hall beyond. Inside, the air is dim and cool. A narrow runner muffles your steps as you cross to the table. The cards are thick, the edges bordered in deep black that narrow slightly at the corners. Beside them sits a dip pen in a stand, its nib bright from recent cleaning, and a shallow dish of black sealing wax ready to be softened over the lamp. A narrow-mouthed glass bottle of ink waits, its contents darker than coal even in this light. The mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, mourning cards were sent or delivered by hand to announce a death and to acknowledge condolences. Their black borders made their purpose unmistakable. The thickness of the line often reflected the closeness of the loss, just as with mourning stationery. Families kept a supply at the ready during the mourning period, ensuring that callers could leave their name without intruding, or that notices could be dispatched swiftly. A silver tray holds cards already bearing names in fine script, neighbors, shopkeepers, even the local vicar. Some are written in the same hand, suggesting that a household servant has been tasked with recording visitors' calls. The cards form a quiet ledger of respect, each name a step taken up the front walk, a hand lifted to knock, a few words exchanged in low tones. You pick up one of the blank cards and feel the weight of it substantial enough to seem important, yet not so heavy as to be cumbersome. The surface is smooth beneath your fingers, the border matte against the slight gloss of the central panel. The pen beside it lies ready, its tip fine enough to form each letter cleanly without blotting. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. Some households, wishing to keep certain calls private, kept two trays, one for names to be preserved, one for those to be quietly discarded after the formal period ended. In larger houses, a parlor maid might be instructed to lay out the more impressive collection when particular guests were expected, a subtle display of social connection disguised as a record of sympathy. Historians still argue whether the practice of leaving one's card at a mourning house was truly universal, or whether it was more rigidly observed in certain districts and among particular social classes. Surviving bundles of such cards often come from well-documented households, leaving open the question of whether quieter streets kept the same formality or simply relied on word of mouth. A low voice from within the house asks if you have come to leave your name. You write it carefully, each letter upright and narrow, mindful, not to blot. The ink shines for a moment before sinking into the paper, the black edge framing it like a picture. You place the card face up in the tray, where it joins a small row of others from this morning alone. Near the table, a narrow shelf holds folded sheets of black-edged writing paper, ready for longer notes. A candle burns in a plain holder, its flame steady in the still air. The wax on the sealing stick bears the slight impression of the household crest from earlier letters. Everything here has been arranged for a single purpose: to receive the names and words of those who choose to step inside. A soft tread on the stair above signals someone descending, and you step back toward the door, not wishing to intrude. Outside, the air feels lighter, the daylight brighter against the black edge of the card you still hold in your mind. The tray remains in its place, and the cards will continue to gather there, each one a silent conversation between the living and the house that mourns. You leave the doorway and follow the sound of iron-shod hooves on wet stone. It grows louder as you turn into a broader street, where a black carriage moves slowly ahead of you. Its panels are polished to a mirror's dull glow, the brass fittings dimmed but still catching what little light the sky allows. Children trail behind it in uneven steps, barefoot, or in boots too large, caps pulled down against the drizzle. They keep to the edge of the road, close enough to watch, far enough not to draw a glance from the driver. This is not an uncommon sight here. Street children following a hearse, not as mourners, but as witnesses to the day's slow spectacle. A mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, funerals, especially those of the better off, were public events whether intended or not. The size of the carriage, the number of plumes, the presence of mutes or pallbearers all told a story to anyone who cared to read it. Children, with nothing to keep them indoors, read it as well as any adult, though their interest was more in the novelty than in the grief. The horse's tack gives off the faint smell of leather darkened by rain. The carriage wheels hum over the smoother stones, then clatter briefly where the road dips to meet a crossing. The driver sits high and straight, coat collar turned up, reins held steady. Inside, the glass sides are curtained, though you can glimpse the coffin's corner a glint of plate, the edge of black cloth when the curtains stir with the carriage's movement. One fringe tidbit you once overheard from a carman. Certain children made a habit of following hearses in the hope of earning a halfpenny to carry messages or open gates along the route. Others claimed the plumes or ribbons that might loosen in the wind could be caught and kept as small trophies. Whether these tales are truth or invention, the sight of children keeping pace with the slow dignity of a funeral is common enough to make them part of the city's unofficial pageantry. Historians still argue whether the fascination of the young was unique to London's crowded streets or part of a broader Victorian curiosity with death's outward forms. Some point to sketches and accounts from provincial towns showing the same trailing lines of children. Others insist the density of the capital gave the practice its particular persistence. In either case, the image survives. Thin figures, quick eyes, and the willingness to follow a route whose end they will not enter. One boy carries a stick, tracing it along the curb as he walks. Another darts ahead to glance under the horse's hooves, then falls back into place. They do not speak much, and when they do, it is in low bursts that vanish under the steady rhythm of the carriage. A taller girl, her skirt hemmed dark with damp, keeps her gaze fixed on the plumes, 4 black ostrich feathers nodding with each step of the lead horses. The procession turns, and the children cross behind it, stepping into the street to keep their view. A costermonger pauses in arranging his barrow to watch them pass. A constable on the corner rests his hand on his cane, but does not move to shoo them away. In this city, the boundary between bystander and participant is often no more than a matter of distance. You walk a little behind, far enough not to be mistaken for part of the procession, close enough to hear the faint creak of the carriage's springs. The rain beads on your coat and runs in narrow lines down your sleeve. When the hearse reaches a wider road, the children spread out, some falling back, others trotting ahead to catch another glimpse before the turn toward the church. As they go, one boy tips his cap briefly toward the horses, not in salute, but in a gesture that might mean he has seen enough. Another breaks away entirely, disappearing into a side lane without a backward glance. The girl with the damp hem walks on a little further, then stops to watch until the black carriage is no more than a shadow in the gray light. You take a final look at the narrowing distance, the plumes still moving like small, patient waves, and then turn down your own way. The street feels quieter for their passing, the echo of small feet fading into the soft patter of rain. The rain eases as you come to a shop whose window is dressed in a way that needs no words. Behind the glass, coffin plates gleam in quiet rows, each one an oval or rectangle of polished metal, engraved with names and dates in precise script. Some are silvered, others brass, all catching the gray light in measured flashes. Beside them, tall funeral plumes stand in holders, black ostrich feathers rising in soft curves, their quills bound in velvet and trimmed with narrow braid. The undertaker's window is more than display. It is a catalogue of possibility. A mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, Such windows were both advertisement and reassurance, showing the quality of the work that could be provided when the time came. Even those who passed without needing the service would glance in, noting the finish of the plates or the fullness of the plumes for future reference. Mourning was business as well as custom, and the front window told you how the house conducted both. You pause before a pair of coffin plates set on a black cloth backing. The engraving is deep enough to cast a shadow in the softened light. One bears an elaborate border of scrolls and leaves. The other is plain but for the clean serif of its letters. Each has 4 small holes for the screws that will hold it to the coffin lid. Each will be polished one last time before being fixed in place. A fringe tidbit you've heard. Some undertakers kept a few plates engraved only with dates, leaving the name to be added later by a traveling engraver who could work in the house on short notice. This allowed for faster preparation when time was short or when the family wished for burial without delay. Others stocked plates with generic inscriptions, "Our dear mother," "Beloved child," for those who could not afford or did not wish to commission a personal engraving. Historians still argue whether these window displays were seen as respectful or as a form of morbid curiosity. Some contemporary accounts describe them as dignified, even comforting. Others suggest they were a kind of street theater, drawing passers-by to peer at the tools of death as if at curiosities. What is certain is that few people passed without at least a glance, the polished metal catching the corner of the eye. The plumes beside the plates sway slightly when the shop door opens for another customer. Up close, you can see the fine stitching that binds the feathers to their stems, the way each quill is wrapped to hide the wire beneath. When mounted on the hearse horse's headpieces, they will move with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a kind of breathing that marks the pace of the procession. In the lower part of the window sits a small case of fittings, coffin handles of cast brass, decorative screws, and narrow strips of velvet edging. Each rests in its own compartment, the arrangement precise, as if even these unseen details deserved to be in order before they were called to use. A length of black fringe lies coiled in one corner, the loops tight and even, waiting to be tacked along the edge of a pall. The undertaker himself appears briefly at the door, speaking to someone in the street. His coat is cut long and narrow, his hat banded in black, his gloves the same dull finish you saw on the mutes earlier. He glances once at the window as if to be sure nothing has been disturbed, then steps back inside. You study the glass from your own reflection outward, the faint shape of your hat and coat, the shimmer of the plates, the soft plume above them. The rain has left tiny beads on the glass, making each reflection waver slightly when you move. It is easy to imagine this same window lit by lamps in the evening, the plates glowing like moons against the dark. A carriage passes behind you, the sound low and steady. For a moment, the plumes in the window seem to sway in answer, though it is only the air from the opening door. You take one last look before stepping away, the display lingering in your mind as a kind of inventory not only of objects, but of the careful calm with which they are kept. The scent reaches you before the sight, a deep treacly sweetness mingled with the damp smell of fresh bread. At the corner, a small bakery window is dimmer than most, the usual bright loaves replaced with darker shapes resting on wooden trays. A hand-lettered sign in the glass reads simply, "Mourning buns." Inside, the counter is laid with rows of small, round buns whose crusts are nearly black, their tops brushed to a faint shine. You push open the door, and the bell above it gives a soft, uncertain ring. The air is warm and heavy with the smell of molasses and rye, the sharpness of yeast tamed by slow baking. Behind the counter, the baker wears an apron smudged with fine flour and dark streaks of treacle. He nods in greeting and gestures toward the cooling rack where another batch rests, the heat still rising from their domed tops. The mainstream fact is that, in some parts of Victorian London, bakers prepared special breads or buns for households in mourning dyed darker with treacle, molasses, or even burnt sugar, to align with the somber palette of the day. They were served with tea after the funeral, or given to visitors who came to pay respects, much like the sweeter funeral biscuits, but with more substance for the appetite. Some families ordered them in quantity to feed those who had traveled far for the service. You choose one from the tray. The crust is firm, but the inside yields easily when broken, revealing a soft crumb marbled with darker streaks where the treacle pooled during baking. It smells faintly of anise and something earthier, perhaps from the rye. When you taste it, the sweetness is deep, almost smoky, the texture both tender and solid enough to satisfy. A fringe tidbit the baker shares. In certain districts, it was considered unlucky to slice a morning bun. Instead, it was to be broken by hand, the pieces shared without a knife touching them. Some say the shape should remain uncut to preserve the household's unity during a time of loss. Whether this belief was widely held or only a local habit, the baker shrugs. He makes the buns round and sturdy regardless. Historians still argue whether these black buns were truly a consistent mourning custom or simply a regional food that happened to be adopted for funerals. References appear in parish accounts and personal letters, but not in the formal etiquette books, suggesting they were a practical gesture rather than a prescribed one. Some recipes survive in community cookbooks, where they sit alongside everyday breads, their name changed or softened, dark spice bun, or treacle loaf as the years went on. The baker wraps 2 buns in brown paper, folding the corners neatly before tying them with plain string. He does not offer a bag. These are meant to be carried in the hand, warm if possible. On the shelf behind him, more buns wait beneath a clean cloth, their tops just visible. A small chalkboard lists the price by the dozen, with a note that orders must be placed a day ahead. Near the door, a narrow table holds a pot of weak tea and a few cups, for those waiting on an order or stopping briefly on their way elsewhere. You sip a little, letting the warmth balance the weight of the bread in your other hand. Outside, the mist clings to the window, blurring the outlines of the street. You step back into the gray air, the scent of treacle following you. The buns are heavy in their paper, holding their heat against your palm. As you walk, you imagine them set out in a quiet parlor, broken into pieces, and passed from hand to hand. The act of sharing as much a part of the custom as the taste itself. In the rhythm of Victorian mourning, even bread could take on the shape and color of grief, and yet still offer comfort enough to be eaten slowly, without haste. The air has turned heavier by the time you reach the dressmaker's window. Inside, bolts of fabric lean in tidy ranks, wool, crepe, bombazine, each in a different shade of black. Some swallow the light entirely. Others hold a faint sheen, like coal dust when the sun strikes it. In the corner, a mannequin stands draped in a lighter gown, the skirt hem lifted to reveal a cotton petticoat. A card at its feet reads, "Summer Mourning, special cut for warm weather." You step in, and the shop's air feels close but not stifling. The scent of pressed cloth and beeswax polish lingers, with a faint undertone of starch. At the back, the dressmaker sits with a yard of gauzy black lawn stretched across her lap, needle moving in small, even stitches. She looks up and nods toward a rail where lighter-weight garments hang, half-sleeved bodices, skirts lined in pale cotton instead of wool, and veils of net fine enough to lift in the slightest breeze. The mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, mourning dress adapted to the season. While full mourning in winter called for heavy, matte fabrics, crepe being the strictest, summer versions allowed for lawn, silk, or lighter bombazine, provided the color and lack of ornament were observed. The aim was to meet etiquette without inviting faintness in the heat. Still, even in summer, bright trims and jewelry were out of the question. The palette remained unbroken black, or softened only by the dull gloss of jet. You run a hand over one of the skirts. The fabric is cool and smooth, lighter than it appears, with a subtle stiffness from the finish. It would keep its shape in the humid air yet allow for movement without clinging. Nearby, a stack of broad-brimmed mourning bonnets rests on the counter, each lined in silk to match the gown, each with ties of black ribbon long enough to bow low beneath the chin. The dressmaker tells you, as she threads a new needle, that some women commission 2 gowns at once, one in the strict winter style, one for summer, so they could move between them without altering the length of the mourning period. A fringe tidbit follows in her low voice. She once made a gown with a hidden panel of white lawn inside the bodice, so the wearer would feel cooler without showing any break in the outward black. It was a quiet kindness, unseen except by the one who wore it. Historians still argue how closely the seasonal adjustments to mourning were followed outside the higher social circles. Etiquette manuals spoke confidently on the subject, but many working women simply shortened sleeves or loosened bodices on existing dresses rather than paying for an entirely new garment. In some households, a single black dress did duty across the seasons, the weight managed with what could be worn beneath. You step aside as the dressmaker lifts a length of crepe from the table and shakes it lightly to settle its folds. The sound is dry, almost papery, as it falls back into place. She measures a strip for trimming a bonnet brim, the black of it so absolute it seems to erase the outline of her hand. On the shelf behind her, small boxes hold jet buttons, matte beads, and narrow braid for edging sleeves or seams. The light through the window shows the fabrics in their truest shades. Some are the blue-black of new ink, others warm with the faintest brown, like polished walnut. You can see how a summer gown, though lighter, might still keep the dignity expected for visits of condolence or for attendance at a funeral. In the corner, a hat stand holds two parasols, their canopies made of thin black silk, the ribs tipped in plain wood rather than bright metal. One has a lining of dull gray, said to make the sun's glare less sharp without showing color to the outside. Such details are easy to miss, but matter greatly to those who wish to be beyond reproach in their observance. The dressmaker folds a finished bodice and places it in a paper wrapper, the black edge of the packet the only decoration. She marks the customer's name in ink at the corner and sets it on a high shelf, away from the dust of the street. When she returns to her chair, she smooths the gauze across her lap again, her needle resuming its quiet path. You thank her and step out, the difference in air striking you at once. The street feels warmer, and you understand why even the strictest households found ways to lighten the physical weight of mourning clothes in summer. The black might stay, but the fabric could be coaxed into letting the body breathe. It is a concession not to vanity, but to endurance. You follow the slope of the street until a smell meets you that is richer than anything you've passed today, thick, green, and heavy, as if the air itself has been steeped in petals. Ahead, a barrow stands half under an awning, piled with blooms whose stems are bound in damp paper. The vendor, coat collar turned up against the weather, is arranging a mound of white lilies so that each trumpet faces outward. Beside them, darker heads of hothouse roses lean in clusters, their scent almost sweet enough to disguise the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from a nearby flue. You step closer, the wet boards under your boots creaking faintly. On the ground, buckets of chrysanthemums, hyacinths, and sprigs of rosemary crowd together, their greens deepened by rain. Some blooms are fully open, others still cupped tight, waiting for the warmth of a room to coax them wider. The vendor gestures to a crate lined with straw. Inside, carnations of a pale cream, their edges brushed with a color so faint it could be mistaken for shadow. The mainstream fact is clear. Flowers were an established part of Victorian funerals, though the specific choices and arrangements carried layers of meaning. Lilies for purity, roses for love or remembrance, immortelles for the unending nature of grief. They were sent ahead to the house or carried in the procession, then laid at the grave or kept in the home for days after, filling the air with a fragrance that clung to clothing and curtains. You pick up a single lily, careful not to bruise its petals. The texture is cool and waxy, the stem damp from the bucket. Its scent is almost too much in the close air, thick enough to taste. The vendor wraps it in paper, printed faintly with a shipping agent's mark, evidence of its journey from warmer glasshouse to this damp street. A fringe tidbit. Some mourners avoided the strongest scented flowers altogether, believing the perfume could mask the smell of the sick room too well, making it harder to tell when a body was failing. Others sought those same blooms precisely for that reason, seeing them as a kindness to the household. The choice often said as much about the giver as about the one mourned. Historians still argue about the extent to which Victorian funeral flowers were shaped by the formal language of blooms popularized in earlier decades. Some funeral orders seem to follow the old codes exactly. Others ignore them entirely, choosing instead what was seasonally available or affordable. In the city's poorer parishes, flowers might be limited to whatever grew in a yard or could be bought cheaply from the day's market surplus. The vendor leans over the barrow to show you wreaths in various stages of completion. One is woven with immortelles, stiff, papery flowers that keep their shape and color long after cutting. Another, fresher, has its ribbon tails pinned under until the name can be added in gold leaf. In the corner of the barrow lies a sheaf bound in black crepe, the ends of its stems wrapped in moist moss to keep them from wilting before the service. Rain dots the paper as you tuck the lily under your arm. The scent follows you as you move away, clinging faintly to your coat. Ahead, you see the street bend toward a churchyard, the spire cutting a pale point into the gray sky. Somewhere, out of sight, a bell marks the quarter hour, its tone softened by distance but clear enough to carry. You glance once more at the barrow, the blooms shifting slightly in the breeze. They are both ornament and offering bright against the day's dimness, yet bound to the same quiet purpose as the black cloth and crepe you have seen along the way. Even in their richness, they belong to mourning. You turn away from the flower barrow and follow a narrow side street where the houses seem to lean in toward one another. At the corner, a small brass plate reads "Visitors by appointment," though you know the custom here well enough to ignore it. The door is answered after a pause by a maid in a plain black dress, her apron folded neatly at the waist. She ushers you into a narrow parlor, where the curtains are drawn halfway and a faint fire burns low in the grate. The room smells faintly of beeswax and tea leaves, with an undertone of damp wool from coats hung in the hall. On the table sits a tray of black-edged calling cards, placed beside a covered dish that likely holds a plate of biscuits or small cakes. The chairs are arranged not for conversation, but for rotation, two by the fire, two by the window, and one set slightly apart for a guest to take briefly before moving on. The mainstream fact is that condolence visits in Victorian London followed a firm sequence. Relatives closest to the deceased were visited first, followed by intimate friends, then by acquaintances and business connections. One did not arrive unannounced unless particularly close to the family. The length of the call was measured, and the tone was one of quiet presence rather than lively talk. You take the offered chair and accept the cup of tea the maid brings. The cup itself is plain white, with a narrow black band at the rim. You wrap your fingers around it, letting the warmth settle into your hands. In the corner, a small clock ticks gently, marking the minutes without urging them forward. The hostess, dressed in a morning gown, with a crepe veil thrown back, speaks in a low, even voice. She asks after your family, nods at your answer, and makes no effort to steer the conversation elsewhere. This is not the place for distraction or cheer. The visit is an acknowledgement, a shared keeping of the day, a fringe tidbit you once read in a household guide. Some families kept a ledger specifically for condolence visits, noting the names and dates so that return calls could be made after the formal mourning period ended. In certain circles, failing to return such a call was considered a lapse in etiquette, even years later. The ledger might be kept in a drawer near the front door, ready for the parlor maid to record a caller's details. Historians still debate whether such strict visiting sequences were adhered to by working-class households, where time and travel made long rounds impractical. Some records suggest abbreviated versions of the custom, perhaps only a handful of visits, or visits combined with errands, while wealthier homes often kept to the full progression. You sip your tea, the warmth and faint bitterness steadying against the damp air outside. The room's quiet is broken only by the faint shift of coals in the grate and the occasional creak from the hallway. When you set your cup down, the saucer's porcelain gives the gentlest chime, quickly absorbed into the stillness. The hostess rises, signaling that the visit is drawing to its close. You stand, offer your hand, and she presses it briefly before stepping back. No words of farewell are needed. The visit's purpose has been fulfilled in its calm brevity. The maid shows you to the door, opening it just wide enough for you to step into the gray light. As it closes behind you, the sound of the latch feels final but not unfriendly. You walk on, knowing that tomorrow the same room will receive others in the same quiet manner, each leaving their small entry in the household's record of who came to stand, for a few minutes, beside their grief. You turn onto a street lined with shop fronts whose windows are dim with condensation. One in particular draws you a florist's window layered with wreaths, each resting on black draped boards. Some are simple rings of evergreen, while others are elaborate constructions of flowers and ribbon, their shapes more sculpture than bouquet. The air shifts as you open the door, and the fragrance inside folds over you damp leaves, crushed petals, and the faint sweetness of water in galvanized buckets. The florist, a man in shirt sleeves with a black armband above the elbow, is tying a length of dull gold ribbon onto a wreath of white immortelles. The flowers are papery to the touch, their pale faces packed tightly so they will hold together even when the air dries them further. This wreath is meant to last, to be placed on a grave and remain intact for weeks, perhaps months, before weather finally claims it. A mainstream fact is that immortelles, whether real dried flowers or artificial ones fashioned from silk, wire, and beads, were a staple of Victorian funerals. They were chosen for their endurance, a visible sign that remembrance would not fade quickly. Many were woven into wreaths or crosses, then fixed to metal stands for display at the graveside. Fresh flowers might wilt in a day, but immortelles were a statement of persistence. You step to the side table where smaller wreaths are arranged. One is made entirely of laurel leaves, glossy even in the dim light, edged with a narrow line of black ribbon. Another combines deep crimson roses with tiny sprays of myrtle, the colors rich but subdued. A third holds a cluster of artificial violets at its base, so precisely made that you must look closely to see the wire beneath. A fringe tidbit you once heard from a gravedigger comes to mind. In some cemeteries, the immortelles would be collected after a year and stored in a shed, in case the family wanted them back for another grave. Some were reused, their ribbons replaced, their frames repaired, and sent out again into the city's quiet circuits of mourning. Historians still argue about how often such wreaths were actually purchased by the families themselves, and how often they were gifts from friends, colleagues, or societies. Funeral records sometimes list wreaths supplied, but the detail of who ordered them and who paid rarely survives. Photographs of elaborate funerals show dozens piled against the churchyard wall, yet many burials went without any such ornament at all. The florist lifts another wreath to show you its detail. This one is circular, with a broad base of boxwood, over which sprays of lilies are arranged to form a diagonal across the ring. A black ribbon loops loosely between them, its tails cut into long, forked points. He turns it slowly, so you can see the way each stem is wired and hidden beneath the foliage. Near the counter, a shallow drawer holds ribbons in muted colors: black, gray, cream, and the occasional deep purple. The gold you saw earlier is reserved for certain orders, regimental funerals, perhaps, or those where the family wishes a touch of solemn brightness. The florist's scissors lie open on the bench, the edges dulled from cutting so much fabric and wire. He wraps the wreath you choose in heavy paper, leaving one side open so the flowers can breathe. The paper is tied with a single loop of black cord, easy to slip free at the churchyard. When you lift it, the weight is more than you expect, the damp stems and wire frame making it a solid presence in your hand. You thank him and step back into the cool air. The scent of the shop clings to you, a mingling of green and sweet that seems brighter for the contrast with the gray day. As you walk, the ribbon trails lightly in the breeze, a small, constant movement against the stillness of the street. You follow the curve of the road until the muffled sound of metal on metal reaches you, a single, deliberate chime, then silence, then another. Ahead, a man in a dark coat and broad-brimmed hat walks slowly along the pavement, a small handbell swinging from his gloved hand. He pauses at intervals, lifting the bell and sounding it once, the note low but carrying. At his side, a narrow leather satchel hangs against his hip, its flap secured with a brass button. This is the parish beadle, marking a death within the boundaries of his charge. The bell is small enough to be managed in one hand, but its tone has a weight that seems to push against the air. A mainstream fact is that in certain districts of Victorian London, the tolling handbell was used to publicly announce a parishioner's death, the beadle walking a set route so that all within earshot would know of the passing. In some parishes, the number of rings corresponded to the age or status of the deceased. In others, the chime was uniform for all. You step to the side as he nears, the faint smell of rain-damp leather drifting from his coat. The bell's handle is worn smooth where his fingers curl around it, the brass darkened from years of use. When he raises it, the motion is slow, the clapper striking with a sound that hangs in the gray light before fading into the damp. A fringe tidbit you've heard. Some beadles lined the inside of their satchels with black cloth when on morning duty, so that any papers or small parcels they carried would not flash white when the flap was lifted. Others tied a narrow ribbon to the bell's handle during such rounds, the tail brushing their wrist with each swing. Whether this was common practice or only the habit of a few, the effect was the same, an added note of solemnity to a familiar role. Historians still argue whether the bell route was always tied to a specific map of the parish, or adjusted to the known haunts of those most likely to hear. Records show some beadles walking a strict circuit from church gate to market and back. Others seem to have varied their path, perhaps to reach streets less often passed by official notice. You follow for a short stretch, counting the steps between chimes 10, sometimes 12, depending on the ground. Each time, he turns his head slightly, as if listening to how the sound carries, judging whether it has reached the row of windows above or the court down the alley. Now and then, a curtain shifts. A door opens just wide enough for someone to lean out, hear the note, and close it again without a word. When he stops, it is outside a house with shutters drawn and a strip of crepe tied to the knocker. He rings the bell once more, then lets it hang at his side while he steps to the door. The exchange is brief, a folded paper from the satchel, a nod from the maid who answers, and then he turns away to continue the round. The sound of the bell seems to settle into the street after he passes, as if the stones have absorbed it. You watch him until the movement of the handle is too small to see, the faint chime arriving a moment later, already softened by distance. You turn back the way you came, the echo of his pace still in your mind, steady, deliberate, and without hurry. In a city full of sudden noise, the measured toll of the handbell remains one of the quietest ways to tell the whole street that something has ended. The street bends toward a row of narrow shop fronts, and at the corner you see a sign painted in neat serif letters, "Milliner to Ladies in Mourning." The window holds a careful arrangement, bonnets of varying shapes, veils folded and draped to show their length, lengths of black ribbon coiled like soft rope. Inside, the air is faintly scented with sighs and steam from the pressing iron. Bolts of silk stand upright against one wall, their black surfaces broken only by the dim line of a selvage edge. Behind the counter, the milliner adjusts a bonnet on a stand, tilting it a fraction forward so the curve of the brim casts a deeper shadow over the imagined wearer's face. Her own dress is simple, the bodice high-necked, the sleeves tight at the wrist. She greets you without brightening her voice custom as much as consideration and gestures toward a row of styles on the shelf behind her. The mainstream fact is that mourning milliners played a crucial role in Victorian London, ensuring women could meet the exacting demands of etiquette. A full mourning bonnet was typically made of dull black crepe, with a long veil to fall over the face and shoulders. Half mourning might allow for silk with a soft sheen, a shorter veil, or a touch of dull white or gray in the trimming. Hats, when chosen, were still modest and plain, their crowns low, their brims narrow. You reach for a bonnet displayed on the nearest stand. Its brim is lined with silk, stitched with tiny, even running stitches, visible only on close inspection. The veil attached to it is fine netting, edged with a narrow binding that keeps it from fraying when lifted. It feels light in the hand, but would weigh on the head once the folds of crepe were arranged to fall evenly. The milliner explains that some clients choose to have the veils sewn in permanently, while others prefer pins so they can be removed when indoors. A fringe tidbit she shares: certain widows, weary of the constant dimness behind the veil, would have a second, shorter one made for private use, transparent enough to read through while keeping the heavier version for public view. Such accommodations were never spoken of outside the fitting room, but they kept the wearer from feeling entirely closed off from the world. Historians still argue how strictly veil lengths and bonnet shapes adhered to the codes printed in etiquette manuals. Fashion plates of the era show variety even within the bounds of mourning, while portraits sometimes depict bonnets far plainer than any plate would suggest. It's likely the reality depended as much on budget and milliner's stock as on printed instruction. On a side table lies a tray of trimmings, narrow pleats of crepe, velvet bows cut square, rosettes of silk pressed flat as coins. A shallow drawer beneath it holds combs for securing veils, their teeth polished smooth, their tops wrapped in ribbon to keep them from catching on hair. The milliner lifts one and demonstrates how it would hold the veil in place, the gesture practiced and efficient. A customer enters, a young woman with her veil drawn forward. Her voice is low as she asks for a bonnet to replace one worn thin by months of use. The milliner measures her head quickly, noting the number in a small ledger before disappearing into the back room. The rustle of paper and the faint thump of a hatbox lid come through the open doorway. You take one last look at the row of bonnets. The differences are subtle, a slightly deeper brim here, a tighter curve there, but each is made to suit a particular stage of mourning. In this work, precision is a courtesy. The right cut spares the wearer the awkwardness of appearing either too deep in grief or too soon out of it. The milliner returns with a hatbox tied in black ribbon, setting it gently on the counter. The young woman thanks her, voice barely above a whisper, and leaves without lifting her veil. The bell above the door gives a small, muffled ring. You step out next, the air cooler after the shop's warmth. The black curve of the bonnet you touched lingers in your mind, its veil a kind of portable shadow that can be lifted, but never quite put away. The street narrows again, the pavement slick underfoot, until you come to a shop with no goods in its window, only a plain curtain and a signboard painted with the words "Mourning Warehouse," by hire or sale. Inside, the air smells faintly of lavender and the sharper scent of camphor, used to keep moths from the fabrics. The room is lined with shelves and rails holding garments in graded shades of black, from the flat, lightless tone of deep crepe to the faint sheen of silk for half mourning. Near the door, a tall desk holds an open ledger. The clerk, in a sober black waistcoat, writes in it with neat strokes of the pen, pausing to blot before turning the page. Behind him, hatboxes are stacked in careful columns, each marked with the customer's name and the return date. On a lower shelf, bundles of gloves are tied in pairs with narrow black tape, the sizes written on small tags in copperplate script. The mainstream fact is that mourning warehouses in Victorian London often operated as rental houses, supplying complete outfits for the required period. A family could hire clothing for weeks or months, then return it when etiquette allowed a return to color. The warehouse kept garments in readiness, altered to fit, laundered, and stored until needed again. For those who could not or would not buy new, it was a way to be properly dressed without the expense of ownership. The clerk closes the ledger and steps into the back room, where you hear the quiet folding of cloth. A seamstress emerges carrying a jacket, its lapels faced in crepe, and lays it across the counter for inspection. The buttons are dull jet, sewn on with matching thread. The hem has been brushed to remove any trace of lint. Her fingers check each seam before she sets it aside in a pile marked for delivery. A fringe tidbit told to you once by a former employee: certain warehouses kept a day book, not just for rentals but for quick exchanges. If a mourner found themselves unexpectedly attending a funeral of higher formality, they could swap a lighter outfit for full mourning without paying a full new hire. These exchanges were done quietly, with no entry in the public ledger. Historians still argue about how much of the rental trade was driven by genuine adherence to etiquette and how much by appearances meant to satisfy neighbors' eyes. In poorer districts, a single hired garment might pass through several households in a season. In wealthier ones, rentals were often indistinguishable from bespoke clothing. On one wall, a row of mourning cloaks hangs from pegs. They are cut long and straight, meant to fall from shoulder to ankle. Their linings made of lighter cotton so the wearer would not tire under their weight. Beside them, shelves hold hats with black bands, bonnets with veils neatly folded, and small boxes containing brooches, armbands, and cravats. The clerk returns, placing a folded skirt on the counter and noting something in the ledger. He dusts a bit of lint from the fabric with a small brush, then wraps it in paper, tying the bundle with black twine. The parcel is labeled in the same steady hand as the ledger entries. You take in the quiet efficiency of the place. There is no display, no ornament. Everything here exists to meet a need that is both urgent and temporary. The garments will pass from one set of hands to another, worn for a few weeks or months, then return to these same shelves to wait in their lavender-scented dark. Stepping outside, You feel the change in air immediately, the scent of cloth replaced by damp stone, and the faint trace of coal smoke drifting down the narrow lane. Behind you, the warehouse door closes without a sound, and the ledger inside records another brief chapter in the life of a coat, a dress, a veil. You reach a junction where the street opens wider, and the sound of slow hooves on wet stone draws your eye. From the far end comes a small procession, a pair of black horses, their harness polished but without gleam, drawing a hearse with glass sides. Behind it walks a single figure in deep mourning, her veil drawn forward so the fabric moves faintly with each step. Her pace is steady, neither hurried nor hesitant, matching the rhythm of the horses as though bound to them by an unseen thread. The mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, widows were expected to follow the coffin on foot if the distance to the church or cemetery allowed, especially in the early months of bereavement. The act was both public acknowledgement and private farewell, a visible expression of loyalty that the community would see and silently judge. Her clothing today is unbroken black full-length skirt, tightly fitted bodice, long crepe veil reaching almost to the ground, the rain beads on the veil, each drop catching in the net before sliding away. From beneath, you catch the faintest glimpse of her gloved hands, fingers curled around a small handkerchief, edged in black. No one walks beside her. The space to her right and left is left deliberately clear, a corridor of air and silence. A fringe tidbit you've heard from an old undertaker. Some widows paid careful attention to the pace they kept behind the coffin. Too fast, and it could be seen as eagerness to be done. Too slow, and it risked looking like display. The perfect pace was measured by the horses steady enough to hold dignity, slow enough to make each step deliberate. Historians still argue about how universal this practice of walking was, especially for widows of modest means. Diaries suggest that in poorer districts, or when the burial ground lay far from home, carriages were taken more often, and the idea of walking was reserved for the wealthier, or for those whose loss was keenly noted by the community. The street seems to draw itself inward as she passes, the sound of footfalls and hoofbeats absorbing other noises. Windows above show pale faces behind glass. A shopkeeper pauses in his doorway, hat held low, until the hearse and the widow have gone by. Even the rain seems quieter for those few moments. Her boots make no sound you can hear from where you stand, though the wet stones shine where she has stepped. The horse's plumes nod with each stride, scattering droplets. Through the hearse's glass, the coffin is draped in a pall edged with fringe, its plate catching the light when the curtain stirs. When the procession turns the corner, she follows without glance or pause, the line of her figure narrowing until the veil and skirt merge into the shadows of the street beyond. You stand for a moment after they have gone, the image of that solitary walk still clear before you, one figure keeping time with loss, measured step by measured step. The street beyond the procession is quieter, lined with low brick houses whose windows are draped in black. At one doorway, the knocker is bound with a strip of crepe that hangs limp in the damp air. You pause a moment, taking in the way it dulls the brass beneath, the fabric drinking what little light the sky offers. The mainstream fact is that door and knocker drapings were a common way to mark a house in mourning during the Victorian period. They served both as notice to visitors and as a sign to passers-by that the household's routines had shifted into the slower, muted pattern that etiquette demanded. The fabric could be simple crepe, gauze, or even black silk in wealthier homes. In some cases, it extended beyond the knocker to frame the whole doorway. The door here is painted a deep green, but the black cloth overrides its color, making the entrance look like an opening into shadow. You imagine the bell or knocker beneath the wrapping, muffled, so no sound would carry sharply into the rooms beyond. In the city's quieter streets, even the absence of sound could be a kind of announcement. A fringe tidbit told to you by a retired footman comes to mind. In some houses, the door was opened just a fraction more slowly during mourning, even for deliveries. It was a small, deliberate courtesy to the mood of the day, as if the hinge itself understood the household's pace. The cloth over the knocker was left in place until the official period of mourning ended, no matter how frayed it became in the weather. Historians still argue about whether the use of crepe at the door was a universal practice across classes or more common in households that expected frequent callers. Surviving photographs show both modest terraces and grand townhouses marked in the same way, but written accounts suggest that in poorer neighborhoods, the custom might be skipped entirely, replaced by word of mouth. The rain has eased to a mist, and you notice how the fabric on this door glistens faintly where the threads catch the damp. Its edges curl slightly from repeated wetting and drying, but the knot at the back of the knocker is tight, holding firm against the weather. You imagine the first morning it was tied there the measured way. The house's servant or a hired man would have looped and folded it, securing it so it would hang straight without twisting in the wind. It was not decoration, but a signal, one as legible to the street as the toll of a bell or the passing of a hearse. As you pass on, you see another house marked the same way, though here the cloth covers only the knocker's handle, the lion's head plate above still visible in the dull light. Each variation seems to tell its own quiet version of the same message. Inside, life is moving slowly, voices are low, and nothing new will be started until the mourning cloth is gone. You leave the narrow street and cross into a small square, where a cluster of children stand around something propped on a wooden easel. Drawing closer, you see it is a memorial photograph, mounted and placed beneath a sheet of glass. The image is stiffly posed, a family grouped around a chair where a child sits upright, eyes open but faintly distant, hands resting in her lap. The backdrop is plain, the light soft, yet the stillness of the figure marks her apart from the living beside her. The mainstream fact is that in Victorian London, post-mortem photography was a known, if somber, custom. Families sometimes commissioned a final portrait of the deceased, posed to resemble peaceful sleep or, in the case of children, seated as if in life. The photograph might be displayed during the mourning period or kept in an album brought out on anniversaries. The frame here is edged in black, its corners gilded just enough to catch the day's dim light. A narrow ribbon is pinned across one corner, a small sprig of dried myrtle tucked beneath. On the lower margin of the photograph, the studio's name is embossed in small, precise lettering, a reminder that even in grief, this was a professional service. A fringe tidbit you once overheard in a print shop. Some photographers kept a supply of painted backdrops with faint clouds or garden scenes, thought to lend a sense of tranquility to the image. In certain cases, the backgrounds were touched up after the sitting, adding faint color to cheeks or flowers to the lap, the better to soften the viewer's memory. Historians still argue whether post-mortem photographs were as widespread as the surviving examples suggest. Some records hint that they were more common among the middle classes, who could afford both the photograph and the framing, while working-class families might have relied on sketches or simply memory. Others argue that cheap studio offers brought the custom within reach of many, though in less elaborate form. You watch as one of the older children points out a detail in the photograph to the others, a fold in the dress perhaps, or the ribbon in the hair. Their voices are low, more curious than mournful, as if the image were part of the street's furniture rather than a private relic. A woman passes, glances once, and continues on without pause. The glass over the photograph has caught a scattering of raindrops, blurring small portions of the image. Through the streaks, the child's figure remains steady, her face pale against the darker clothes of those around her. The photographer's careful lighting has ensured that, even now, her outline is clear against the background. You move on, the image lingering at the edge of your thoughts, one moment fixed forever, standing outside the rush of the street, as much a part of mourning as the draped doorways and black-rimmed cards. The street bends toward the Thames, where the air carries a sharper edge coal smoke laced with the faint salt of the tide. You stop near a landing where a group of men stand beside a flat barge moored to the quay. Its deck holds a row of plain coffins, each draped in unadorned black cloth, their corners weighted to keep the coverings from lifting in the wind. The water slaps against the timbers below, a slow and steady sound beneath the murmur of voices. The mainstream fact is that, in Victorian London, river transport was sometimes used to carry coffins from the city to burial grounds further downstream. In an era when churchyards within the city were overcrowded, cemeteries were opened beyond its limits, and the Thames served as a quiet, if unconventional, route. The journey could spare the family the cost of a long overland procession, and for some, it was faster than the crowded streets. The men on the quay wear dark coats and scarves, their caps pulled low. One kneels to adjust a cord, securing the draped edge of a coffin, knotting it with practiced hands. Another leans on the railing, eyes on the river's current, as if measuring the tide. The boatman waits at the stern, gloved hands resting on the tiller, his posture still but ready. A fringe tidbit you once read in a river pilot's memoir. Some barge owners line their decks with evergreen branches before laying the coffins in place, both to steady them and to lend a faint scent to the journey. By the time the cargo reached its destination, the leaves were often flattened and darkened, but the gesture was thought to lend dignity to the passage. Historians still argue about how frequently the Thames was used for this purpose, and whether it was considered respectable or merely practical. Surviving accounts suggest it varied by district and by the means of the family. For some, the water route was chosen quietly, without mention in public notices. You watch as two men lift the last coffin aboard, their motions slow, each step measured to keep the weight even. When it is settled, the drape is smoothed over and pinned at the corners. The barge's rope is untied from the cleat, and the boatman takes up his place, eyes on the channel ahead. The tide pulls the water in long, shallow swells, the coffins shifting only slightly with the motion. From the quay, the barge's departure is silent, save for the creak of timber and the slap of water against the hull. It moves steadily toward the bend, the black cloths a line of quiet against the pale river. You stand until the shape is nearly gone, its presence marked only by the wake it leaves a faint, widening ripple that spreads toward both banks before fading into the tide's own pattern. You turn back from the quay, following a lane that climbs toward the higher streets, and soon the sound of a hammer draws your attention. Outside a narrow shop, a man is working at a bench, shaping small plaques of polished metal. The bench is scattered with tools, files, engraving burins, soft cloths blackened with polish. Beside him, a wooden case holds finished coffin plates, each engraved with a name, a date, and in some cases, a brief inscription in precise copperplate script. The mainstream fact is that coffin plates were a standard feature of Victorian funerary practice, serving as both identification and a final mark of respect. Made of brass, tin, pewter, or more rarely silver, they were fixed to the coffin lid before burial, bearing the essential details of the deceased. For wealthier families, the plate might be ornately chased, with borders of scrollwork or floral patterns. The man at the bench wears a leather apron, its surface dulled from years of metal dust. He holds the latest plate in a cloth-lined vise, leaning close as he scores a letter into the surface. The tap of the hammer on the graver is steady and deliberate, leaving each stroke in the neat, flowing style that the trade demanded. A fringe tidbit you've read in a tradesman's ledger. Some families requested a second plate to be kept as a household memento. In these cases, the plate was polished, mounted on a wooden backing, and hung discreetly in a parlor or kept in a drawer with other keepsakes. It was not a universal habit, but those who did it considered the plate a more tangible remembrance than a lock of hair or a photograph. Historians still argue whether coffin plates in poorer districts were always engraved by professionals or sometimes marked by the undertaker's own hand. Surviving examples vary in quality, some crisp and finely worked, others with letters slightly uneven, suggesting the tools were used less often. The shop smells faintly of metal polish and lamp oil, with a sharper tang of filed tin in the air. On a shelf above the bench sit a few blank plates of different shapes: oval, shield, rectangular with rounded corners, ready for orders that might arrive without warning. The man reaches for a small brush, sweeping away the fine dust from the engraved grooves before rubbing the surface with a soft cloth. In the doorway, a young boy waits, holding a folded slip of paper. The man sets down his tools, reads the paper silently, and nods. From beneath the bench, he draws a narrow box containing an unfinished plate, already cut to size. The boy steps inside, closing the door behind him, and the sound of the hammer resumes steady, unhurried, each strike marking another letter into permanence. You move on, the rhythm of metal on metal following you up the street until it blends with the more distant sounds of carts and hoofbeats. The lane curves into a quieter quarter, where small shop fronts press close together beneath narrow upper windows. One has its curtains drawn halfway, but the door stands open, revealing a display that spills gently into the street. Hat stands lined with veiled bonnets, shelves stacked with black gloves, bolts of crepe folded into flat, heavy stacks. The scent here is a mix of fabric dye, sizing, and the faint must of wool kept from the sun. The mainstream fact is that Victorian London supported a thriving trade in mourning attire, from specialist drapers to milliners who worked exclusively in shades of black and gray. Strict etiquette dictated how long one wore full mourning, half mourning, and finally colors again periods that could last months or even years depending on the relation lost. Shops like this kept entire households outfitted in the correct degree of solemnity. A mannequin in the window wears a widow's cap, the white muslin crisp beneath a long crepe veil. Beside it, a second figure shows half-mourning dark silk trimmed with pale lavender ribbons, a sign of gradual return to color. Small cards rest on the shelf edges, their script precise. All mourning orders executed with dispatch. Inside, the shopkeeper moves with quiet precision, lifting lengths of crepe to the counter for a customer whose gloved fingers test the weave. A fringe tidbit once mentioned in a seamstress's memoir drifts to mind. In poorer districts, black dye was sometimes refreshed at home with makeshift solutions of tea, ink, or soot water to extend a garment's use. While the color could fade unevenly, the effort signaled respectability and adherence to custom, even when new cloth was beyond reach. Historians still argue whether all classes followed mourning rules strictly, or if, outside of genteel circles, they were adapted more loosely. Some surviving garments show careful alteration, suggesting they were re-dyed for reuse between different periods of mourning, while others hint at a more pragmatic approach, black worn for only a few weeks before work or cost made a return to color necessary. The crepe catches the dim light like water frozen mid-ripple, its texture both matte and slightly rough to the touch. Bonnets hang from pegs, some with wide brims to shield the face from view, others trimmed with a restrained bow. Gloves are laid in open boxes, their fingers resting neatly together, the leather cool and smooth. At the back of the shop, a narrow stair rises to a workroom where the muffled thump of a treadle sewing machine keeps steady time. Bolts of fabric stand against the wall, their edges bound in tape to keep them from fraying. A small case by the till holds mourning jewelry jet brooches carved in floral shapes, lockets for hair, and watch chains with black enamel links. You linger a moment at the threshold, noting the way each item seems to hold its own quiet. The weight of the crepe, the hush of the gloves, the low light that makes the black seem deeper still. When you step away, the door's bell gives a soft, single chime, and the air outside feels a shade paler in comparison. The street narrows again, leading you toward a row of townhouses whose fronts are set close to the pavement. In one upper window, the curtains are drawn but parted slightly in the center. Through the gap you glimpse a narrow table on which rests a wreath not of fresh flowers, but of hair woven into looping patterns and framed beneath glass. The strands range in color from pale gold to deep brown, their luster muted in the dim light of the room. The mainstream fact is that hairwork mourning wreaths were a notable Victorian custom, created as memorials from the hair of the deceased, or, in some cases, hair from multiple family members woven together. These intricate designs were mounted in shadow boxes and displayed in parlors or drawing rooms as both remembrance and ornament. Some were simple plaits, others were elaborate arrangements of curls, loops, and sprays shaped into flowers or leaves. The window's wreath has a central rosette flanked by two branching sprays, each curl held in place by fine wire. The frame is oval, its wood stained dark, with a narrow gilt line around the inner edge. A small card rests in the bottom corner, though the writing is too fine to read from the street. A fringe tidbit recorded in a hairworker's trade catalog comes to mind. Not all hair was from the deceased. Families sometimes sent locks cut during life, especially from children, so that the final wreath would contain a blend of the living and the dead, a kind of genealogical keepsake displayed in one composition. It was seen as both sentimental and unifying, though some preferred to keep the hair of the deceased separate. Historians still argue whether hairwork was most often made at home or commissioned from professional artisans. Pattern books survived that allowed skilled amateurs to attempt the work themselves, but the precision of surviving examples suggests many were crafted by those who specialized in the delicate process. The light in the room shifts slightly as a figure passes behind the curtains, adjusting them just enough to close the gap. The faint reflection of the street replaces your view of the wreath, leaving only the memory of its looping shapes and the muted glint of gilt. You move on, picturing the hours it would take to weave such patterns, the careful washing and sorting of the strands, the tying and shaping until the final piece could be mounted. In the quiet, it seems a kind of work that demands the same patience as mourning itself, slow, deliberate, and measured against nothing but the passage of time. The day draws toward evening as you find yourself in a churchyard hemmed by soot-dark walls. The gate hangs slightly ajar, its latch worn smooth by decades of hands. Inside, the grass grows in uneven tufts between leaning stones. Some so weathered their inscriptions have melted into the surface. Near the far wall stands a lich gate, its timber beams darkened with age, roof tiled in mossy slate. The mainstream fact is that lich gates, common in English churchyards, served as a sheltered place where the coffin would rest before the burial service. In Victorian London, the gate marked the meeting point between the procession and the officiating clergy, and its roof offered a pause in both journey and ritual. Here, prayers could be said, and the pallbearers might take a moment's relief from the weight they carried. The gate's oak frame is carved with small, almost shy flourishes, leaves curling around the joints, a faintly Gothic arch beneath the eaves. A simple bench runs along each side, worn to a smooth gloss where hands and coats have passed over it. In one corner, a pair of black-edged funeral cards lies tucked into a crack in the wall, their edges curled from damp. A fringe tidbit once told by a sexton. In certain parishes, the lich gate was also a place where village notices were discreetly exchanged. Mourners waiting for the service might murmur about the state of the fields, a neighbor's health, or the price of coal, small matters spoken in subdued tones, as if to acknowledge that life pressed on even at the edge of a grave. Historians still argue whether the lich gate's use in the city was purely ceremonial, or if, as in rural areas, it also carried a social function. In some surviving parish records, the gate is mentioned simply as the starting point of the service. In others, it is described in ways that suggest a longer pause, with space for conversation and recollection. The air beneath the gate smells faintly of damp wood and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Above, the rafters show the marks of old repairs, pegs replaced, joints tightened. On the bench, a faint ring of lighter wood hints where a basket or small case once sat for a long hour. As you stand, the last of the light slips between the roof slats, pooling in narrow bars on the flagstones. The hush here is not complete distant wheels on cobbles, a bell far off, but it is deeper than the streets beyond. It feels like the pause in breath between one step and the next, a space that holds both arrival and departure without insisting on either. You leave the lich gate as the sky turns to the color of pewter, the day's shape softening into shadow. The latch falls into place behind you with a dry, small click, and the street beyond carries you onward in its slower evening tide. The streets are quieter now, their edges blurred by the settling dusk. Shops have shuttered, leaving only the faint spill of lamplight through curtained windows. The air feels heavier, not with rain, but with the slow weight of evening, an hour when the city seems to lean back on its heels, breathing in the day's last traces. You walk without direction, your steps unhurried. The cobbles beneath your boots are cool, their rounded surfaces polished by years of passing feet. Somewhere close, the faint hiss of a gas lamp steadies into its evening rhythm. A carriage rattles far off, its wheels softened by distance until they are only a low, rolling hum. Through narrow lanes and along broader streets, you see the remains of the day's mourning ribbons pinned to doors, wreaths faded to the color of dust, black crepe lifting faintly in the night breeze. The customs you've passed linger like gentle imprints, the shape of a photograph in a window, the weight of fabric on a counter, the scent of flowers pressed into still air. You turn once more toward the river, where the water moves darkly under the lamps, each ripple catching the light before folding back into shadow. It carries the same quiet as the churchyard, the same slow, measured pace. Here, the city's pulse is steady but softened, as though it has set aside its busyness for the night. Your breath matches the rhythm of the water, in and out, slow and without effort. The world around you narrows to the simplest things: the cool air against your face, the muted gleam of lamplight on stone, the sound of your own steps finding their way home. And in that steady, unbroken rhythm, the city exhales, and so do you. End of script. Sweet dreams.